Over in my homepage here, you'll see that I have a list of all of the posts published by users whose account I follow in our application. And you'll also see that these are an assortment of different types of posts. So I've got my single images, I've got carousel posts, and further down the line, I also have video posts in which can play a full video. And if I would like, I could choose to engage with these posts either by adding a like to this or even choosing to add a comment if I would like. And you'll see when I publish the comment here, it's going to add it to a list of all of the comments added on that particular post. Also back on my homepage, you'll also notice that I have the ability to view stories published by the people that I also follow. And of course, these stories will only be accessible for a 24-hour period. And if I wanted to view these, I could click on the user's icon. It's then going to display that story on a pop-up and it will automatically advance through the list of stories published by this person. And what you'll also find is once I've viewed their story, the icon around their profile photo will be grayed out, just like the real-world Instagram experience. And then over on my Discover page here, it's going to display a list of posts published by people who I don't yet follow. And if I would like to view the full post, I could click on this. That post would then be displayed within the small little pop-up, and I could even click through to the user's profile. And on this user's profile, if I would like, I could choose to give them a follow, or I could even message the user if I would like. And that's going to send me through to a dedicated chat page where I can see a list of all of the message history that I have with this particular user. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build an Instagram clone entirely out of no code using Bubbles tool. In 2021, I'd taken the time to build my very first version of my Instagram clone tutorial, which at the time just covered the steps to build out a basic version of an Instagram MVP. However, with the launch of Bubbles' new Flexbox responsive engine, I wanted to take the time to re-record this whole tutorial from scratch. Now, while I was re-recording this tutorial, I also decided to add in a whole suite of additional features that I didn't include in the previous version of the tutorial. So in this version, I'm going to include things like how users can create stories, how to create a messaging feature between users, as well as in-app notifications, and so much more. But of course, if you're new to Bubble, I'd just like to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'd previously worked with the Bubble team to write their How to Build blog series. This series took a list of the top products out there on the market, like Uber, Airbnb, and even Instagram, and explained the step-by-step process to rebuilding them with no code using Bubbles tool. And since then, I've decided to recreate these as a video series, just because I personally found when I was learning Bubbles no code tool, it was much easier to follow along with a video guide. But of course, I'd also just like to highlight that this video series has no affiliation with Bubble at all, and it's something that I'm doing within my own time. What I personally love the most about Bubble is, unlike other no-code tools, it's a complete one-stop solution. It gives you the ability to create your own custom database, the front-end design of your application, the ability to stitch everything together using workflows, which will make your app functional, and finally the ability to integrate with third-party tools and services. And within today's tutorial, you'll see exactly what I mean when we bring our own Instagram clone product to life. Throughout that process of building our Instagram clone, I'm going to cover all of the core features you need to add into this app, including being able to register new user accounts, giving the ability for users to create image posts, carousel posts, and even video posts. Of course, we're also going to build out a feed on our homepage to display a full list of posts, in which users can either like or comment on those posts. And even from there, when someone engages on a post, we're going to send them a notification to let them know that that has occurred. And of course, I'm also going to include features like creating a message inbox, building out a discover page, and finally allowing users to publish and view stories across our Instagram homepage. Look, there's so much that I want to cover throughout this tutorial, So let's just grab our bubble editor and we can dive right into it. Within our Instagram clone build today, the first thing I wanted to cover was not building any core features that users are going to interact with within our app. Instead, I just wanted to take the time to structure and set up the necessary database we'll need in order to power all the features within our application. And if you're relatively new to Bubble, you might not have any experience creating a database from scratch. And the purpose of this tutorial is to explain everything you need to know throughout that process. And of course, as we add in all of the necessary data types and data fields, I'm going to explain how they're applicable to each of the features we're going to be building out within our Instagram app. But when it comes to structuring not only just your database, but the entirety of your Bubble build, I personally just like to create a Notion doc, which I use as a checklist, which just allows me to add in all of the different data types and data fields I'm going to include in my database, as well as a list of all of the features I'd like to build out within our application. And what I love about Notion is that it allows you to just tick off where things are as you add them into your application, which just lets you keep a better track of where you are throughout the build. And of course, I'll be sure to include a link to this Notion doc so you can make a copy of it yourself. But as I mentioned, the first thing we're going to do here is just add in all of the necessary data types and data fields. And now when it comes to creating a database within Bubble, if I was to open up a brand new Bubble editor from scratch here, and then open up my data tab, what you'll see is that within your database, everything is broken down into two separate columns. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see that you have what's referred to as data types, and within that you'll have what's referred to as data fields. And now the difference between the two is that a data type is an overarching data entity, and all of the fields are the information you would like to store for that entity. So as you can see, by default here within Bubble's database, they've already pre-created a user data type, and within that data type, it allows you to store all of the data fields, which is all of the information you want to store on your users. And by default, you'll see there is an email field here, and there is also a password field, but Bubble just hides that from being in plain text. And of course, the reason why Bubble has already pre-created a user data type and the email data field is because in order to register an account, people are obviously going to need to be registered as a user with an email and a password. And then from here, what we're going to need to do ourselves is not only build out all of the additional data fields we'd like to store within a user's account, so things like their profile photo, their username, and their bio, but we're also going to need to add in all of the additional data types that we'd like to store in our database. And these are all of the main headings that I have listed out here in my Notion doc. And when it comes to understanding when you need to create a data type, the way I personally like to approach things is that in my application, if a user ever needs to create something on their own, that should be a data type. So you can see here I have a data type of a user because a user would create their own account. Then I have a data type referring to Instagram posts because a user would obviously want to create posts. Within that, I also have things like the content of that post, which I'll explain why I've split that out in a moment. But then I have things also like the comments, because a user will need to be able to create a comment. A user will need to be able to create a chat between two users, and so on. And I'll be explaining all of these out in more detail as I add them into my database. And so what I'm actually going to do is just add all these into my Bubble editor, and I'll be explaining exactly why we're using them as I add them in. And when it comes to building out a database, I personally recommend adding in all of your data types before you start to build out all of the data fields within each of those. And the reason I recommend doing that is because, as you might notice in my Notion checklist here, some data fields actually link to separate data types. And so in order to reference those data types, we obviously need to add those in first. And so if I jump over into my Bubble editor here, as I mentioned, we have a pre-existing user data type, so we don't need to create that. The only thing I do just want to make note of when it comes to our user data type is that you'll see a little heading here that just says that there are privacy rules applied by default to this data type. If we were to click on these, what you'll see is that Bubble has added a default privacy setting onto this data type, which essentially just means that only users will be able to see the content that they create within the application, and no one else who isn't that user will be able to see that. And now, while that can be best practice for things like internal tools or dashboards, when you're building a social application, you want every single user to be able to see the content of other users on the platform. And so this privacy rule is actually something we don't want to build with. So we're going to head over to the trash icon here and just delete that. We're then going to jump back into our data types menu here. And now you'll see that the user data type is publicly visible, which is exactly what we want in our application. And from here, I'm going to start building out all of the additional data types that I'd like to add into our app. So if I jump back into Notion, you can see that the next data type is going to be a post. So every single time a user wants to create an Instagram post, because they're creating something in our database, we're going to make that a data type. So I'm just going to type in the word post here, and I'm going to choose to create that. And then from here, the next data type I would like to add is what's referred to as the post content. And now technically this is going to be pretty much the same as an Instagram post. However, what I've intentionally done is I've split this data type into two separate options. And the reason I'm doing that is because on our post content data type here, this is where I'm going to be storing all of the data intensive fields. So things like the caption, which can be a long string of text, as well as the images, the carousel images, or even a video file. And the reason I have in fact split this from the separate post type is because every single time you would like to, let's say, load a list of posts within your application, in every instance, Bubble will load all of the data fields that are associated with a post, which is fine if you're loading some simple data like how many people have liked a post, as well as if the post was a single image or a carousel. But when you need to start loading all of the additional data for all of the images or video files for a post, it can quickly slow your application down if you're loading hundreds or if not thousands of posts at once. And so what I personally like to do is I like to create a separate data type for the content that belongs to a post. And then what I'll do is I'll link a data field to our separate data type, which just allows us to later on reference the actual file of the post itself. So the image or video created with that post. And that's just going to help maintain the actual speed of our application as it starts to scale. And of course, when we actually build out the feature to upload and display posts, I'm going to be explaining everything you need to know about that in more detail. But for the time being, I'm just going to jump back into my Bubble editor here, and I'm going to add in a new data type called post content, remembering that this data type is going to store all of the data intensive fields of an individual post. I'll choose to create that. Then if I jump back into my Notion doc, I'm going to scroll on down and I can see that the next data type we'll need to add is a comment. So every single time a user creates a comment, we're going to need to obviously store an entry in our database. So I'm going to jump into Bubble and I'm going to add in the comment data type. And while we're here, one thing I should also mention is that when you're creating data types, you should never use a plural for your data type, just because it can become quite confusing later on whenever you're creating an entry in your database. And one thing you'll need to remember is that whenever someone creates a comment, they are creating a singular comment. They're not creating multiple comments, which just means that you will not need to use a plural for your data type. And so while you only have a data type referred to as one comment, you'll be able to store all of the comments published within your application under that data type. But I just can't stress enough that you should never use a plural for your data type. I'm then going to jump back into Notion. I'm going to scroll on down. And the next data type I want to add in is referred to as a chat. And now a chat will allow us to create essentially like a message space between two users within our app. And so I'm going to head over to our Bubble editor. I'm going to add in a new data type called chat. And within that, what you'll see now is that the next data type I want to add is referred to as a message. And so within a chat, there's going to be multiple messages. And you'll see later on within the data fields of my message that I link every single message back to an original chat, just so that way within a chat, I know which specific messages to display between two users. But for the time being, I'm just going to need to add in the data type first. So I'm going to head over to my Bubble editor. I'm going to type in the word message. I'll I'll choose to create that data type. I'll then jump back into Notion, and I can see that the next data type I'll need to add is a notification. So obviously within our application, people are going to comment and like on people's posts. And whenever someone does that, I want them to create a notification in our database, which is just going to notify a user that someone has engaged with their post. And so I'm going to jump over to our bubble editor once again. I'm going to type in the word notification. I'll create that data field. I'll then jump back into my Notion checklist here. And the very last two data fields I have is for Instagram stories. And so when it comes to our application today, we are in fact going to be building out an Instagram stories feature. When we build that, we're going to be using a third-party plugin which will streamline the whole process for us. But it's important that we also create data fields that will integrate with that plugin nicely. And so essentially every single time someone publishes a story, we're going to need to create an entry within our database. So I'm going to jump over to my bubble editor, type in the data type of a story. I'll choose to create that. And then finally, the very last data type I have is just a viewed story. So whenever someone actually views someone's story, I want to make note of that within my database. So that way we know that we can mark that story as viewed. And in order to do that, I am going to need to create this as a separate data type. So I'm going to jump into Bubble here, and I'm going to type in the words viewed story. I will create that. And that is all of the data types we'll need to add within our application. What we can now do is take the time to build out all of the necessary data fields under each data type. And as I mentioned, the data fields will store all of the information that we want to save and display for each of these data types. And I'm going to start by building out all of the data fields under our user data type. So as I mentioned, by default, the user data type will have an email and a password field stored within it. And that is, of course, because when you register a user's account, they're the two fields you're going to need to register. But what I'd also like to do is add in some additional information for each user, like their username, their actual name, their bio, and their profile photo. And so if I jump back into my Notion checklist here, I'm just going to scroll on up, and what you'll see here is a list of all of the data fields I'd like to add underneath my user data type. And so I'm going to now just start to build all of these out, and I'll explain what each of these data fields is going to be used for as we walk through that process. And so the very first data field I want to create is just going to be the actual name of a user. So I'm going to choose to create a new field. I'm going to call this the name. And when it comes to the type of data field this is just going to be a plain text entry. It's nice and simple. Then below this, I'd like to create another data field, which is going to be the username for a user. And this is essentially just like their Instagram handle, so it's their unique ID. And this will also be a text field type. I would then like to create another data field and call this the bio. So this is going to be the about section that's displayed on someone's profile. And this field type will yet again just be a standard text field. It's nice and straightforward. And then from here, I'm going to create another field. And this is going to be used to store someone's profile photo. And this field type will be an image, because we're obviously going to want to store a photo within this field. I'll choose to create that. And then finally, under our user data type, I'd like to add in two additional fields. And that is a list of all of the people who not only follow this user, but also a list of all of the people that this user follows. And so I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this followers. And when it comes to this field here, as I mentioned, I'd like this to be a list of users. So every single time someone selects to follow a user, I'm going to add them to that list of users. And with this field type here, I'm going to set this to be a user, which is our existing user data type. And I would like to tick that this should be a list with multiple entries, because we're going to be adding multiple users to that list, because obviously someone can have more than just one follower. I'm going to choose to create this. And then I'm going to create pretty much the exact same field, only this time I'm going to call it following. So this is going to determine a list of all of the people that this user is following. And once again, this field type will be linked to our user data type. And I'm going to select that this is a list with multiple entries. And now if we jump back into our Notion checklist here, I can tick off that we've finished adding in all of the data fields under our user data type. If we scroll on down now to the next data type, I'd like to build out all of the data fields underneath each post that's created. So I'm going to jump back into my bubble editor here. I'm going to open up my post data type. And whenever a post is published within an application, there's a few key things I want to store within that. The first is that I want a way to identify if the post is an image, a carousel, or even a video. And the way I'm going to do that is create 3 separate data fields that are just going to recognize what the type of post is. And so I'm going to create the first data field here, and I'm going to call this is single post. And when it comes to this field, I'm going to set this to be a yes/no value. And so the Instagram post that's being published either will be a single image post or it won't be a single image post. I'll choose to create this. And by default, I'm going to set the value of this to be no. And later on, when we learn how we can upload a single image post, we're going to update the value of this field to equal yes. But by default, I want this to equal no. And then we're going to create pretty much the exact same thing, but I'm going to recognize now a data field called is carousel post. And this is yet again going to be a field type of a yes/no value with a default value set to no. So of course, by default, the post won't be any particular type, but if a user is in fact publishing a carousel post with multiple images, I'd like to update the value of this to equal yes. And then finally, the very last field is going to be called is video post. I can see I just have a small typo there, but this field type is once again going to be a yes/no option. I'll create that, and the default value of this should be no. And now that's how we can determine what style of post each Instagram post is going to be within our application. What I'd also like to do now though is link our post data type to the post content data type. So as I mentioned, under our post data type here, I'm just going to try and store as many lightweight data fields as possible. So things that aren't data intensive. And then under our post content data type, that's where I'm going to store all of those heavier data fields. And then I'm only going to choose to load those data fields whenever they're necessary within our app. I don't want to load them by default. And so what I'm going to do under our post data type here is create a data field. And I'm going to call this field the actual content of the post. So this is where most of the substance will be. And this field type here is going to link to our post content data type. And because only one post content will link to one post, I will not select that this is a field with multiple entries. So I'm going to leave that blank. I'll choose to create this. And this is where you can start to see the power of Bubble's no-code database. It allows you to build completely relational databases where everything is intertwined and connected. But now after linking the content of each post to an individual post, the next field I'd like to register is the list of people who are going to like this post. And when it comes to this, I'm going to create this as a list of users. So essentially every single time someone likes a post, I'm going to add them to the list of total people who have liked that post. So I'm going to choose to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this likes. And because I'm storing a list of users, this field type here is going to be set to be a user data type. And I am going to tick that this should be a list with multiple entries. I'll choose to create that. And that's all of the data fields I'll need to add within my post data type. So I'm going to jump back into my Notion checklist here and tick all of those off. If I then scroll down to my post content data type, as I'd mentioned, this is where I'm going to be storing the crux of every single post. So I'm going to be storing things like its caption, the actual image, if it is a single image post, the carousel images, as well as things like the video file. And I'll be explaining these in more detail as I add them into my database. But let's jump on over into our Bubble editor here. We'll open up our post content data type. And I'm going to start by creating our first field, which is going to be the caption for each post. And now the reason I'm storing the caption within our post content, not the actual post, is because if you were to look at the real world Instagram application, captions can be quite long. And so I just want to make sure we're loading this more intensive data field on our separate data type. And so when it comes to this field type here, it's going to be nice and simple. It's just going to be a text field because we're obviously just going to be storing a long string of text. I'll choose to create this. Then for the next data field, I'm going to want to store the value of a single image. And so if someone does create just a standard single image post, this is the data field that's going to store that particular image. So I'm going to set this field type to be an image. I'll then select to create this. And then of course, we're going to need to create a separate data field that's going to cater for someone who wants to publish a carousel post. And a carousel post obviously is a post with multiple images within it. So I'm going to choose to create a data field here, and I'm going to call this carousel images. And so if a user selects that they do want to publish a carousel post, within our application, they're going to upload a series of multiple images. And so for this field type, we're going to select that it should be an image. But as I just mentioned, we're going to need to be able to support someone uploading multiple images. So we're going to tick that this field should be a list with multiple entries. I'll create that. And then of course, within my application today, I'm also going to be explaining how we can upload and display video files. And so I'm going to create a separate data field here that's just going to store the value of a video file. So if someone was to upload a video post, we can of course store that within our database and then play that video. And when it comes to this field type, this is actually going to need to be a file. So if I scroll on down, I'll see the option to add in a file here. And now I won't want to tick that this should be a list with multiple entries. I'm just going to keep this as a single video file in our product today. I'll choose to create this. One thing I should also note is that when it comes to displaying a grid of a user's posts within their profile, with fields like a single image post and a carousel image, I can easily just pull and display either the only image or the first image within a carousel. But if a user has published some video posts, I'm going to need a way to grab a thumbnail image from that video that I can display on their profile. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a separate data field, and I'm going to call this video thumbnail. And whenever someone uploads a video post, I'm also going to have them upload a video thumbnail image. And so this field type here will be an image, and this is going to be the image we'll display on the user's profile grid. I'll choose to create that. And that is all of the data fields we'll need to add into our post content data type. So I'm going to jump back into Notion. We can tick those off, and then we can scroll on down to our next data type, which is our comment data type. So every single time someone comments on a post, I'm going to want to store two things. The first is the actual contents of the comment itself. So that is just the text that they are typing in. And then secondly, I'd also like to link each comment back to an original post. So that way on a separate page, I can display a list of all of the comments that belong to a particular post within our application. And so this comment data type here just has two relatively simple data fields. I'm going to jump over into my bubble editor here. I'll open up my comment data type. And for the first field, as I mentioned, I'm just going to store the content of the comment, which is of course just the text of the comment itself. So as you probably guessed, this field type is just going to be a text field type. I'll choose to create that. And then as I mentioned, I'm going to want to link each particular comment back to a post that it was published on. So I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to want to link it to an original post. So just for an abbreviation, I'm just going to call this OG post. And then for the field type, I will link this back to the post data type. I'll choose to create that. That one was nice and simple. I can then jump back into Notion and just tick those data fields off. And then we can scroll on down to our chat data type. And this data type is relatively straightforward as well. So whenever someone wants to communicate with a user, I'm going to create a chat between those two people. And so within a chat, I'm just going to store a list of users. And whenever a chat is in fact created in our database, I'll be adding to it the two users who are within that chat. And then I have a separate data field here, which is just referred to as the last viewed by user. And what you'll see is that this data field is going to register a date. And the reason why I'm storing the value of a date is because with our inbox page, I'd like to display a notification icon whenever someone has received a message after the last time that they viewed a chat. just because that means that they obviously haven't read the new messages that have been published within that chat between two users. And of course, I'll be explaining how we can build that feature out later whenever we create our chat notifications. But for the time being, I'm just going to jump over into our bubble editor. Under our chat data type, I'm going to create a field, and I'm going to call this chat users. And as I mentioned, this field type is going to be a list of users. So I'll select from the user option and select that this is a list of multiple entries. And then I'm going to create the separate field, which is referred to as last viewed by user. And this, as I mentioned, is going to be a date. So this will just recognize the last time that a user has viewed the chat, which will be a timestamp. I'll choose to create this. Then I can jump back into Notion and check those data fields off. And we're almost finished working our way through the list here. The next data fields I'd like to build out are the data fields within our message data type. So within a chat, a user can publish messages. And the message data type is actually quite similar to the comment data type. Essentially, I'm just going to want to store the actual contents of the message, so that is the text itself. And then I'm going to link each message back to an individual chat, just so on our chat page, I can display all of the messages between two individual users. And so over in my bubble editor, I'm going to open up my message data type. The first data field I'm going to create is referred to as the content of the message. And this will just be a text field type. It's nice and simple. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to need to link each message back to a unique chat. So I'm going to create a separate data field, and this is going to be called original chat. I'm just going to call it OG to abbreviate it. And this field type will link back to the chat data type in our database. I'll then jump into Notion once again and check those fields off. And the next data type we want to build out is the notification data type. So every single time someone either likes or comments on someone's post, what I'm going to want to do is create a notification within our database. And I'd like to recognize if that notification should be a like notification or a comment notification. And then I also want to link that notification back to an original post. And then finally identify who the person is that should be receiving that notification. And so I'm going to jump over to our bubble editor, open up our notification data type. I'll create a new field, and the first field I'm going to create is the isLike data field. And this field type will be a yes/no option. So this is just going to recognize if this notification was created for a like event. And what I'm going to also do is set the default value to be no. And of course, if it was a like notification event, I will later on set the value to yes. I'm also then just going to create a separate data field called isComment. So I'd like to recognize if the notification was created based off a comment event. This will also be a yes/no field type. And like before, I'm going to set the default value to be no. And whenever a notification is created, as I mentioned, I'd also like to link it back to the original post where the engagement event occurred. So I'm going to create a field here called OG post. And this is going to link back to the original post. So I'm going to scroll on down and have this link to our separate post data type. And then finally, I'd also like to identify who the receiving user of this notification should be. So I'm going to create a new field, and I'm going to type in receiving user. And this field type will need to link back to our user data type. And because only one user will be receiving one notification at a time, I will not select that this is a field with multiple entries. I'll choose to create that. And then finally, the last two list of data fields we'll need to add in are relatively straightforward. It's just for our story data type and our viewed story data type. And so within every single story that's published today within our app, I'm just going to need to store the value of a media file, which is either going to be an image or a video for that story. So if I open up my bubble editor here, I'm going to open the story data type. I'll choose to create a field, and I'll call this media file. And this field type will be a file. So regardless of if it is an image or a video, I'm going to store this as a file. And the reason I'm doing that is because that's how it's going to integrate with the plugin we're going to use today to display our stories. I'll choose to create that. and that's the only data field I'll need to add within this data type. So I'm going to jump back into Notion and tick that off. And the very last data field is going to be the story ID within every viewed story. So whenever someone views someone else's story, I want to store the ID of that unique story that they have in fact viewed. And that way I can exclude it from being displayed again on our homepage. And so I'm going to jump over into our bubble editor here. I'm going to head to our viewed story data type. I'll create a data field and I'll call this story ID. And this field type will just be a string of text. I'll choose to create that. And that concludes everything we'll need to add into our database today. As you can see, it's a relatively straightforward process to create your own custom database entirely from scratch within Bubble. And as I mentioned, I know if this is your first time building a database, it can seem a little bit overwhelming. But the main takeaway from this section of our tutorial today is the difference between data types and data fields. And of course, understanding when you'll need to create a data type. So as I mentioned, whenever a user needs to create something within your application, it should most likely be a data type. Once we've finished structuring our database, we can move along to one of the first core features that I want to build out in our tutorial today. And this is actually arguably one of the most intensive features that we're going to cover throughout our whole course. And that is building out the feature that's going to allow someone to create a new Instagram post. And the reason why this section of our tutorial is quite long is because throughout this process, I'm going to be explaining how users can not only upload single image posts, but also carousel posts as well as video posts. And so for each of those individual post types, we're essentially going to have to create a different experience for the uploading process. And so it can take a little bit of time to walk through each of the steps. But of course, I'm going to be sure to cover everything we need to know in as much detail as I possibly can. And in order to dive straight into the process, I'm going to jump into my bubble editor here. And the first thing I'd like to do is open up our page drop-down menu, because I'm going to need to create a brand new page within our application here. And I'm going to be calling this the upload page. I'll choose to create this. And now on this page, I've also just jumped ahead and I've upgraded it to the new Flexbox responsive engine. So if you haven't done that, you'll also need to do that at this point in time. But the first thing I'm going to do on this page is just update the background color here to be a light shade of gray, like I always do, just so that way I can see where the page sits on my overall canvas. I'm also then going to head to my layout tab here, and I'm going to update my container layout to be a column structure, just because we're going to be building this page from top to bottom. And then I'd also like to update the preset width to be a mobile device, so that way the page width will now be 380 pixels. And from here, the very first element I'm going to add onto this page is just a heading element at the top. So I'm going to head to my visual elements and I'll choose to add in a text element. And this will display the words new post. I'm going to want to update the styling of this element. So I'm going to choose to remove the style here. I'll choose to bold the formatting of the words within this element. And then I'm going to align the text within the center of the element itself. I'll then jump over to our layout tab because we're going to need to make this element responsive on our overall page. So I'm going to horizontally align that in the center of my page. I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And like always, I'm going to set the minimum width to 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, just so that way, regardless of how small or how large my page is, it's going to be completely responsive. I'm also going to set the minimum height to be 0, and that's because we have the default option selected here to fit the height of the element to the content within it. So now you can see this element is going to collapse around the text that sits inside of it, which is exactly what we want. And then I'm also just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, just so that way this element doesn't touch the border of my page. And then below this, what I'd like to do is just display a menu of 3 different options, which will allow a user to choose which particular post they would like to publish. And so as I'd mentioned at the start of this tutorial, I'm going to allow users to publish single image posts, as well as carousels and even video posts. And we're just going to create a different uploading experience for each of those posts. But before we can create those unique experiences, we're just going to need the user to determine what type of post they would actually like to publish. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to head to my containers menu here, and I'm going to add a group element onto my page. And the reason I'm going to add a group element is because in a moment I'm going to show you the additional settings that a group can give you when it comes to structuring elements on your page. But the first thing I'd like to do with this group is head over to my Appearance tab, just because I'm going to want to update the styling of it. If I remove the style of this group here, I'm going to update the background color to be a flat color. I'm going to leave that as white. I would then also like to update the roundness of the borders to be 20. And then I'm going to jump over to my layout tab here because I'm going to need to update the container layout option. And now when it comes to this group, I'm essentially going to use this as almost like a header menu. So I'm going to have 3 different text options that will be positioned side by side. So I'm going to allow someone to select to publish a single image post, a carousel, or a video. And whatever text option they select, it's going to determine what upload feature is going to be displayed below this element on our page. And so because I'd like to display elements horizontally across our page, when it comes to the container layout of our group, I'm going to need to set this as a row, not a column. Because if you remember, a row allows us to structure elements side by side, so horizontally across our page. And this is where you can start to see the power of groups come into play. Although our overall page here had the container layout of a column, so it was stacking elements from top to bottom, if you'd ever like to add a section of your page where you want to stack elements from side to side, I'd recommend adding a group element on because it gives you an extra layer of control, and it will also determine the position of any elements that sit within it. So if I was to add in some text elements into this group now, so I'm going to head to my visual elements, and I'm going to add a text element in. I'm going to update this text to display the word post, and then I'm going to remove the style of this text just because I'd like to bold the formatting of it, as well as align the text within the center of the element itself. And then I'm going to jump over to my layout tab here, and I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, like I always have done. And then I'm going to set the minimum height here to be 0 as well. And then I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 pixels of margin at the bottom, and 10 pixels of margin on the left here, just so that way my text element doesn't touch the borders of my overall group there. And now if I was to make a copy of this text element here, what you'll see is that it's going to copy across all of the same responsive settings, only this time I would just like to update the text that's displayed to show the word carousel, so that way if a user would like to publish a carousel post, they can click on this option instead. But one of the only other things I'd like to change with this element is that if I jump over to my layout tab, I'd just like to remove the left-hand side margin. So the left side here had 10 pixels of margin. I no longer want that to be the case. The only reason I'd done that is because I just didn't want this element touching the actual border of our group on the left-hand side, whereas this text element is going to be positioned in the middle of our group. Because while we're adding text elements into our group, I just want to add one last option into our menu here, and I'm going to head to my Appearance tab and update this text to display the word video. So if a user would like to publish a video post, they would select on this option. And because this heading is our last option within the group, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the right, just to ensure it does not touch the border of our white group it sits within. So I'm going to head to my layout tab here and just add in 10 pixels of margin on the right. And of course, I'm going to need to now update the responsive settings of the group that these text elements sit within itself. So if I select on the overall white group here, I'm going to head to my width settings and I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. And I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'm also going to head to our minimum height here and set that to be 0. And because we have the option selected here to fit the height of this group to the elements within it, what you'll see is that because we have 10 pixels of margin at the bottom and the top of our text elements, the group itself won't touch the text within it. It's just going to create a nice border around those elements. But what I would also like to do is just add in some margin onto the actual group element itself. So if I select my overall group here, I'm going to scroll on down to my margin settings, and I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, as well as 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And what you'll now see is that this group no longer touches the borders of our page. So it just looks like a nice header menu on our page there. if I really wanted, I could just head to my page, head to my appearance tab, and just make the page just a darker shade of gray for the time being, just so I can actually see where the white group element sits on my page itself. But what you'll now see is that we have a menu here with 3 different options that a user can choose from. So they can determine if they'd like to publish just a regular post, a carousel post, or even a video post. And this menu is going to be completely responsive across our page, regardless of the size. So because all of the text elements within it don't have a maximum width, they're all just going to stretch out and take up the same equal amount of space at any given time. So if the user's viewing this on a desktop, it's going to span out accordingly. And if a user's viewing this on a mobile, it's also going to collapse accordingly as well. From here though, what I'd like to now do is just create each of the unique ways in which a user is going to be able to upload each of these different types of posts. And we're going to start with just a single image post, just because that is the simplest option to begin with. And so essentially, whenever a user selects that they would like to publish a single image post, what I'm going to do is just display a single picture uploader element, as well as an input field which will allow them to type in a caption. And of course, we're then going to need to build out a workflow which will create that post within our database. And so in order to house all of the elements that I would like to display, I'm going to need to add in another group element onto my page. So I'm going to head to my containers menu here, and I'm going to select to add in a group element. And I'm going to update the name of this to be called group single image post. And like before, I'm first going to update the styling of this group. So I'm going to remove the style of this here. I will update the background color to be a flat color. I will leave it as white. This time I won't update the roundness of the borders for this group, but I would just like to jump to my layout tab here, because I'm going to need to update the container layout of this group. In this case, I'd like to stack the elements within this group from top to bottom, which of course means I'm going to need to select the column option. And then just while we're here, I'm going to unselect that this group should have a fixed width and just set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, just so that way this group's going to be positioned perfectly across my page here for the time being. And as I mentioned, the first element I'd like to add into this group is going to be a single picture uploader. It's nice and simple. So if a user wants to publish a single photo, I'm going to allow them to do that by selecting on the picture uploader element. So I'm going to add the picture uploader into our group here. I'm going to update the name of it to be called picture uploader single image post, just so that way when we create our workflow later on, I know which particular element to reference within the correct workflow step. And then when it comes to the actual size of our picture uploader element, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 340 pixels. And I'm going to leave the maximum width as infinite. And now the reason I'm selecting that the minimum width should be 340 pixels is that my overall page itself is 380 pixels, if you remember. And in a moment, I'm going to be adding in 20 pixels of margin on each side of our white group that this element sits within. And so 380 minus 20 is of course 340. So I'm just going to set the minimum width of this element to be 340 pixels. I'm also going to unselect that this element should be a fixed height, and I'm going to set the minimum height as 340 pixels. And that's just going to ensure that at a minimum, the picture uploader element is just going to be a perfect square. And then below our picture uploader element here, I'm just going to need to add in an input field, which will allow a user to add a caption into their Instagram post. And because a caption can be quite a long string of text, I'd like to add in a multi-line input field, not just a regular input field. So I'm going to drag a multi-line input field into our group here. I'm going to update the name of this to be called multi-line input single post image. I also just have a small typo there I'm going to fix. Perfect. I'm going to update the placeholder text to display the words write a caption ... And then when it comes to the actual layout of this multi-line input field, I'm going to once again unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to leave the maximum width as infinite, but I'm also going to set the minimum width to be 340 pixels yet again. I'm also just going to update the minimum height to be 50 pixels, but I'm going to leave the maximum height as infinite. just so that way while this looks like a single line input field here, it's going to continually expand downwards based on how much text a user actually adds into their caption. I'm also just going to finally add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, just to separate this from the picture uploader element sitting above it there. And then finally, the very last element I'd like to add into this group is just going to be a text element. Although I'd like this to actually be positioned in the top right-hand corner of our group. So I'm going to drag a text element in here. I'll position it in my group. And as I mentioned, I want this to be in the top right-hand corner. So in order to move that up, I could either drag it, or I could head to my layout tab here, and I could select that I want this to be the previous element in our group here. So now you'll see it'll be moved to the top. And when it comes to this text element, I'm just going to update this to display the word share. And this is the text that's going to trigger a workflow every single time a user clicks on it. So when a user selects that they want to share a post, we're going to need to create that post within our database. And because we're going to have 3 different types of posts that can be shared, I'm going to need to give a unique name to this particular text element, just so that way in my workflow editor, I can understand which particular share text button is being clicked to trigger which workflow. So I'm going to type in that this is going to be called text share single image post. And when it comes to the styling of this text element, I'm going to remove the style here because I would like to bold the formatting of this text, as well as update the color to be a light shade of blue that I have here. If you'd like that color code, it's 6468F2. I'm then going to also align this text to the right-hand side of the element. And then of course, I'm gonna need to align this overall element to the right-hand side of my group. So I'm gonna head to my layout tab here, and I'm gonna select that I'd like to horizontally align this to the right-hand side of my group. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0 like always, leaving the maximum width as infinite as well. And then when it comes to the minimum height, I'll set that as 0, just because we have the option selected here to fit the height of the element to the content within it. And I'd also just like to add some space between this text element and our picture uploader. So I'm going to select my picture uploader here, and I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top. And one thing you might have noticed is that when I add my margins onto my elements, I like to try and keep these consistent. So when it comes to any element, I like to add in the margin at the top. So that way, whenever I see some spacing on my group or on my page, I know which particular element that spacing belongs to. So this spacing here, I can see that that will belong to the element below it there, just because the margin is positioned at the top. But the very last thing I'd like to do is just make some changes to the overall group that all of the elements have just been added to. And so what I'm going to do is add in 20 pixels of margin at the top of this group, 20 pixels of margin at the bottom, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And what you'll now see is that this group is positioned nicely within the center of our page. And if I was to jump over to our responsive menu here, what you'd see is that this group is going to be completely responsive, regardless of the size of the device that a user is viewing this page on. And then back in my UI builder, there's one last change I would like to make to this group. And that is that I'll need to update the minimum height to be 0, whilst leaving the maximum height to be infinite. So that way this group is going to be completely responsive vertically as well as horizontally. And then finally, I'd also just like to unselect this option to make this element visible on page load. And what that's going to do is actually hide this group by default on our page. And the reason I want to do that is because I only want this group to be displayed if a user selects the post option from our menu at the top of the page. And we're going to be creating a very similar experience for all of the different unique types of posts that can be published. So in a moment, we're going to be adding another group that will allow a user to publish a carousel post. And we're really going to want that group to be displayed if the user selects that they do in fact want to publish a carousel. And I'll be explaining how we can show and hide these groups in a moment. But the only other option I'd like to change on this group is that after I've removed that this element should be visible on page load, I'm also just going to want to select the collapse when hidden option, which just means that it's going to actually remove the element off our page when it is not being displayed. And that just means that any element that is being displayed will move up and take its place. And if we do ever want to view this group again and make changes to it, we can of course jump over to our elements tree here. I can see our group element is grayed out, and we can select the eye icon, and that will either show or hide the group, just that way it's nice and easy to reference. But from here, what I'd like to do is add in yet another group, because we're now going to build out the experience to upload a carousel post. And there's a little bit more involved within this particular post type, so be sure to follow along carefully. I'm going to jump to my containers menu here. I'm going to add in yet another group, only this time I'll be calling this group carousel post. And when it comes to this group, like before, I'm going to jump to our appearance tab. I'm going to remove the style of this. I'll update the background color to be a flat color. I won't need to change any of the roundness of the borders. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab. I would like this to be a column container layout because I'm going to want to stack elements from top to bottom within this group. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And that, of course, is just going to ensure that this group is fully responsive regardless of the page size that a user is viewing. I'm then going to jump back to my UI builder here. And it's at this point that we're going to allow a user to upload not just one image, but multiple images they'd like to publish within one single Instagram post. And what you may have noticed is that with the input field for the picture uploader element that we'd used before, it only allows a user to add in one image at a time. Whereas, as I said, I'd like a user to add in multiple images at once. And in order to find an element that allows us to do that, we're going to need to install a free plugin. So if we jump to our plugins library here, we're going to open up the plugin tab. And within this plugin tab, we're just going to type in the word multi here. And you'll see an option to install the multi-file uploader drop zone plugin. This is a free plugin built by Bubble. We're going to choose to install that. I'll then close our plugin library, jump back into our design tab here, and what you'll now see under our input forms is we have this option to add in a multi-file uploader. I'm going to choose to add a version of this into our group, and this essentially acts just like a picture uploader element. It allows a user to access their camera roll on their device to upload multiple images at once. But the only downside to this element is that it doesn't display a preview of the image once it has been uploaded. It only displays the file name. However, today I'm going to show you a workaround so we can show the user a preview of all of the slides within their carousel post before they publish it. But before we get into that, what I'm going to need to do is update the name of this input field to be called multi-file uploader carousel post. I'm then going to jump to our layout tab here because I'll need to update the width of this particular input field. And one thing I'd just like to point out is that at this point in time, you may have remembered that at the beginning of our tutorial, I'd mentioned that the Bubble Flexbox responsive engine was currently in beta. And because it is still in beta at this point in time, unfortunately, they don't have the same responsive settings that you would find on any elements added through your traditional element menu here, which just means that we're going to have to add essentially a fixed width for this particular element. So I'm going to set the width here to be 340 pixels. And if I was to horizontally align this in the center of my group, it's going to look fine on a mobile device here, which is the prominent device that users are going to view this page on. But if I was to just jump into my responsive menu here, what you'll see is that that element doesn't expand across the page based on the width of the overall device. One thing I will point out though is that Bubble has mentioned that this is a setting that they're currently working on. So if you do find that you have the option to update the width and height of this element, like any other element, I'd recommend just setting the width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And then to be honest, with this element, you might actually want it to have a fixed height. In this case, I've just got it set as 45 pixels, as you can see. But to be honest, the height of this element isn't completely crucial, just because after a user uploads their images, I'm actually going to display those images within a repeating group element below, not the actual element here. So I'm going to jump back into my UI builder here. And what I'd like to do now, as I mentioned, is just create an experience that allows me to display a list of all of the images that a user has uploaded into our multi-file uploader. And the way in which I can do that is by using what's called a repeating group element. So if I jump into our containers menu here, I'm going to add in a repeating group into our existing white group here. And a repeating group is essentially just a way to display a list of things dynamically within your application. So if you'd ever like to, let's say, create an Instagram homepage feed, which is what we're going to be doing later on, if you wanted to pull from your database all of the Instagram posts, you would need to use a repeating group to do that. So as you can see, it kind of just looks like a list of cells, and each cell represents a unique entry within your database. And so repeating groups are, in my opinion, one of the most powerful elements within Bubble, and you'll find that you need to use them whenever you need to display a list of things to a user. And in our case, what I'd like to do is just create an experience where a user uploads a list of files into our multi-file uploader. But instead of just displaying the file names, what I'd like to do is then hide this particular file uploader and then display a repeating group, which is just going to show a preview of all of the images added into the carousel post. And there's going to be a few complexities as we walk through this process, but of course I'm going to be sure to explain everything in as much detail as I can. And so if I select on my repeating group element here, I'm just going to update the name to be called repeating group carousel preview. And when it comes to our actual repeating group, the first thing we're going to need to do is jump over to our appearance tab, just because I'm going to need to give a data source to this repeating group. So it's going to need a way to identify what particular list of items it should display. And in this case, I want it to display a list of images. So I'm going to scroll on down to the image option here. And the list of images I would like to display is of course going to be the images within our multi-file uploader element. And so for the data source, I would just like it to display a list of images that have been uploaded to our multi-file uploader carousel post, its value, and now it's just going to display a list of all of those files that have been uploaded to our file drop zone here. And because we're creating a carousel post, I actually don't want this repeating group to be displayed vertically. I want it to be displayed horizontally. So I want the images to be positioned side by side. And the way in which I can create that is just by unselecting that I want this to be a fixed number of rows, and also unselecting that I want it to be a fixed number of columns. And then you'll see the option here to update the scroll direction of your repeating group. So that's just the way in which a user can scroll through the list of available items. In this case, I don't want it to be vertical, I want it to be horizontal. So now if we were displaying a list of images, these would eventually be displayed horizontally across our page. And now when it comes to the number of cells that I actually want to display within our repeating group, I'm only going to want to display one image here, one image next to it, and then I'll allow a user to scroll across. I don't want there to be multiple number of rows. I only just want there to be one. And so when it comes to the minimum height of each row, I'm going to update this to be 300 pixels. And then when it comes to the minimum width, I'm also going to update that to be 300 pixels. And now the reason why I've selected 300 pixels, not 380 or even 340 for that matter, is that I want to clearly identify to a user that there is another cell next to this. And so although this only looks like one particular cell within our repeating group now, if there's more than one image, the next cell will be positioned directly next to this, and majority of that cell will be hidden outside the constraint of our page there. But if a user sees just enough of that tile there, it's going to give a pretty good indication that they can actually scroll across to view the rest of that image. And if I was to set the minimum width to be 380 pixels, it would make the repeating group the size of the full page, which might just give the user the impression that it's only displaying one image, not multiple images. And so that's why I've selected to set the minimum width to be 300 pixels. And look, when I'm working with repeating groups, what I like to do is just also remove the style of them. Just because if I scroll on down to the border style option, while I'm working with it, I just want to give it a solid border, which means if I was to click away, I can actually see where the repeating group cell lies on my page. Of course, when you go to preview or publish your application later on, you can remove that line, as well as even the color of the group background that we're working in here. But from here, what I'd like to do is also just click back into my repeating group here, just because there's some additional settings we're going to need to change. And so while we've configured the initial settings here, we're going to need to jump to our layout tab so we can make this repeating group responsive. And so when it comes to this repeating group, I'm going to set the container layout to be a row. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter here if you were to select the row or column option, because we're only going to be displaying one image within one repeating group cell. The reason I'm selecting to choose a row is because if you are only adding in one image, it just gives you a couple of different options to make sure that that image is centered nicely within your overall repeating group. And I'll be explaining that in a moment. but it's not the end of the world if you were to select the column option. This is almost just like a personal preference of mine. But for our repeating group here, I'm also going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will then remove the minimum width here to be 0. And what you'll now see, as I mentioned, is that because we have allowed the repeating group to be a maximum width of infinite, you can actually now see the very next cell on our page here. And if I was to jump into my responsive menu, what you'll see is that if the page was to grow based on the user's device size, the repeating group will just continually display more and more cells. And if the user was only viewing this page on a mobile device, they would have the ability to actually scroll across sideways to view all of these different cells. So that's why we're using a horizontal repeating group today. I'm going to jump back into my UI builder here. We'll come back later on and update the minimum width once we've finished adding the content within this repeating group cell. But from here, what I'd like to do is now add in an image element into this repeating group, which is just going to display a preview of all of the pictures that have been uploaded to our multi-file uploader. And so I'm going to scroll to our visual elements, and I'm going to select to add an image element into our repeating group cell. And when it comes to the type of image I want to display here, I'm going to insert some dynamic data. So if our user was to upload, let's say 4 pictures into our multi-file uploader, there will be 4 repeating group cells that are going to store the information of one of those images. So cell 1 will store the image number 1, cell 2 will store image number 2, and so on. And so what I'd like to do is just insert some dynamic data here that's going to display the current cell that it sits within, its image. And while we're here, I'm also just going to choose to process this with ImgX, just because I'd like to resize the dimensions of the image by cropping them there. That's just a personal preference that I always have. And now when it comes to the size of this image, before we edit the formatting in our layout tab, I'm also just going to add a solid border around this image. And this again is just a personal preference while I'm building my application. Just so that way, if I was to click away, I can actually see where that image sits within my repeating group. I am going to click back on my image though and jump to my layout tab here. And from here, I'm going to vertically align this in the center of my repeating group cell. And the reason I have the ability to vertically align this in the center of my repeating group is because if you remember on my repeating group, I had set the container layout to be a row, which just gives any element that sits within it this extra customization setting, which is why I in fact selected the container layout to be a row. I could also update the container alignment to be centered, so that way it's just going to ensure that this image is horizontally centered in the repeating group at all times. And so now I just know for a fact that this image is always going to be positioned in the center of my overall repeating group. I'm also then going to unselect that this image should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And then when it comes to the height of this element, I'd like to set the minimum height to be 280 pixels. And now the reason I'm doing that is because if I was to select on my overall repeating group, you might remember that I had set the minimum height of each row to be 300 pixels. And the reason why I've selected 280 pixels for our image here is because I'd also just like to add in 10 pixels of margin around each of the borders. And so if we have 10 extra pixels of margin at the top and 10 on the bottom, that's going to equal 20 pixels in total. So 280 pixels here in height plus 20 additional pixels in margin is going to equal 300. So it's just going to make it fit nicely. And that's all of the settings we'll need to configure for our image. The very last thing I'll need to do is select on my repeating group here and update its height. Because we now have an element sitting in it and we know that that element needs 300 pixels in height, I'm going to set the minimum height of our repeating group to also be 300 pixels. And what you'll now see is that that's going to fit quite snug around the image itself. And if we were to open up our responsive menu here, you'll see there's going to be a nice list of images that are going to be displayed whenever a user uploads a carousel post. I'm going to jump back into my UI builder here because the very last thing I'd like to add in this group is just going to be the caption input field as well as the share text that I had explained before. And so I'm just going to scroll on down to our input forms. I'm going to add in a multi-line input field within our group. I'll just need to be careful that I don't drag this within our repeating group. I actually want this to be in our overall white group itself. I'm then just going to want this to be positioned at the bottom of my group. So if I head to my layout tab here, I can move this to the next position in my group, and that will just ensure that it now sits below my repeating group. I'm also going to update the name of this input field to be called multi-line input carousel post. So that way when I create my workflow to publish this carousel post, I can easily reference this particular input field. And similar to before, I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I will, however, set the minimum height as 50, but of course I'll leave this option ticked here to fit the height of this element to the content within it. So that way if a user needs to add in multiple lines of text, it's just going to continually expand downwards. I'm also just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, just so that way our input field doesn't touch our repeating group above it. And then finally, I'm going to jump to our appearance tab, and I'm going to update the placeholder text to display the words write a caption ... And so now the very last element I'm just going to need to add is just the text that displays the word share, which is going to be used to trigger our workflow. And in order to streamline the whole process of adding that in, I'm just going to head to my elements tree. I'm going to display our previous group here. I'm going to copy our existing share text. I'm going to click into our new group and I'm going to paste that in. I can then choose to hide our initial group again. I'm going to jump to my layout tab and I'm going to move this share text to the previous position in our group, which is just going to position it in the top right hand corner. And I'm then going to need to update the name of this to be called text share carousel post. And this, of course, will just allow us to easily identify that this is the share button relevant to a carousel post. And then finally from here, I'm just going to need to add in some margin around the elements that sit within my group. So I'm going to select on my multi-file uploader. I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top. What I'd also just like to do is jump to my appearance tab here, just because I want to add a solid border around this. So that way, if I was to click away, I can actually see where that drop zone is, where we can upload our files. I'm then going to click on my overall repeating group. I'm going to head to my layout tab, and I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top of this element. And then finally, if I was to click on my overall white group here, the very last thing I'd like to do is just set the minimum height to be 0, just because we have the option selected here to fit the height of the element to the content within it. And just when you think we're done with this group, we are not quite there yet. There's a few little changes that I'd still like to make. And that is that when it comes to uploading a list of images to a carousel post, I'm only going to want this repeating group to be displayed when there is a list of images uploaded to our multi-file uploader. And when this list of images has been displayed, I'm then going to want to hide our multi-file uploader itself. So I essentially don't want them being displayed at the same time. I either want one or the other. And the way in which I can do that is by selecting on my repeating group element here. And I can first of all unselect that I'd like this element to be visible on page load, which just means that it's going to be hidden by default. I can then choose to also collapse this element's height when it's hidden. And so that way it's not going to be displayed until we add a condition that allows it to be. And so that means I'm going to need to head to my condition tab here, and we're going to need to create a condition which will identify when our repeating group can be displayed. And within that condition, I'd just like to only allow it to be displayed when images have in fact been uploaded to our multi-file drop zone. So I'm going to need to define a new condition here, and I'm going to recognize when the multi-file uploader, the carousel post, when its value, and of course the value is the number of images it has within it, when the count of all of the images in it is greater than 0, meaning that when it has at least more than 0 files or images uploaded into it, I would like to select that this element is visible and tick that that should be true. And so that way, that means that as soon as a user uploads an image into our multi-file uploader, our repeating group will be displayed. And of course, I'm then going to need to create a condition on our multi-file uploader here that's going to recognize if the repeating group is being displayed, I won't want it to be displayed. Before I create that condition though, I'm just going to head to my elements tree and I'm just going to display my repeating group yet again, just so I can get a good sense of where it's going to sit in my overall group here. I'm then going to click on my multi-file uploader, and I would like to create a new condition on this. And within this, I'm going to recognize when the multi-file uploader carousel post, which is the uploader itself, when its value its count of how many items it has is greater than 0, so the exact same condition as our repeating group, I'm going to select that this element is visible, and I will not check that that is true, which just means that after all of the images have been uploaded, this input will be hidden and our repeating group will be displayed. And when this element is no longer visible, I would also like to make sure its height is collapsed, so that way our repeating group would move up and take its place. So I'm going to head to my layout tab, and while this element should in fact be visible on page load, I'm just going to also tick this option here to collapse it when it is hidden. And then finally, we're going to need to create a similar condition onto our overall white group here. So if I was to select on our group, so our group carousel post, of course, I'm only going to want this group to be displayed when a user selects that they actually want to publish a carousel post. And so by default, this group should not be visible on page load. And when this group is hidden, I would also like to collapse its height. And what you'll see is that it will now be hidden on our page, but I'm not quite done with this group yet. So I'm just going to head to my elements tree and display it one last time, just because I'd like to scroll on down and add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, as well as 20 pixels of margin at the bottom, and then also 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right, so that way it sits within the center of our overall page. And just like that, that's everything we'll need to add into this group. As you can see, it was a little bit more complex than just our single image post option. From here though, what we'll need to do is create yet another group, which is going to allow a user to upload a video post into our application. And so when it comes to creating a video post within our application, I'm going to first of all just hide our carousel group that we've just added. And I'm going to scroll on down and start by adding in yet another group onto our page here. And I'm going to be calling this group video post. Like always, the first thing I'm going to do is head to our appearance tab here. I'm going to remove the style of this group, set the background color to be a flat color of white, just so I can actually see where it sits on my page. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab and update the container layout here to be a column, because I'll yet again be stacking elements in this from top to bottom. I'm also just going to quickly update the width setting here. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, just so the group sits nicely on my page by default. And now when it comes to the elements I'd like to add within this group, in this case, we're going to only be allowing a user to upload one video at a time. So I can scroll on down to my input forms here, and I'm not going to choose to use the picture uploader, obviously because I'm going to want a user to upload a video file. And so instead, I'm going to choose to add in a file uploader element onto our page. And this acts much the same as a picture uploader, only that when a file is uploaded, it's only going to display the file's name in here. It's not going to actually show a preview of the file, which is actually quite similar to our multi-file uploader element. So essentially what's going to happen is a user is going to access their camera roll, they'll upload a video file, and then I'm going to want to display a preview of that video below this. And when that preview is visible, similar to our multi-file uploader on our carousel post, I'm going to want to hide this file uploader and display the video preview. I'm just going to update the name of this file uploader though to be called file uploader video post. And because this element is a native element within our elements menu, we are going to have the ability to completely customize the responsive settings of it. So I'm going to unselect that this should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And then I'd also just like to update the height to be 50 pixels, but I will be keeping this as a fixed height just because I won't want it to be any larger than 50 pixels. And now whenever a video file is uploaded into this element here, what I'd like to do is display a preview of that video. And in order to do that, we're going to need to install yet another free plugin. So we're going to head to our plugins library here once again. I'm going to choose to open up our library, and I'm just going to type in the word HTML here. And what you'll see is that there's a free video plugin here called HTML5 Video. It just allows you to display a video file. So I'm going to choose to install that. I'll select to close my plugin library. I'll then jump back over into my design tab here. And what you'll see is that under our visual elements, we now have the option to add in a video player element. So I'm going to choose to add this into our group. I'm going to update the name of this to be called video player video post. And just while we're working on it, I'm going to first of all update the border of this to have a solid border. just so that way I can see where it sits on my overall page here. And now when it comes to the file of the video that I would like to display, I'm obviously going to want this to be the value of the video file that's been uploaded into our file uploader here. So if I was to click on the video player, I can update the dynamic link, and I'm going to insert dynamic data because I would like to display the video of the file uploader video post, its value, and I'm just going to need to select the URL option here. So essentially, whenever a file is uploaded into our file uploader, it's going to store that on Bubble's server, and that file will have a unique URL in which can be accessed. And in order to access and display that, we're just going to need to reference that URL file. We are also going to add a thumbnail image into this in a moment. But before we do that, I'm going to need to add in a picture uploader element that will allow a user to add a custom thumbnail to this particular video. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is jump over into my layout tab, just because I'd like to update the formatting of this video player. The first thing I'm going to want to do is center this horizontally within my white group. I'm then going to need to update the width and height of this. I'm going to set the width as 340 pixels. Again, the reason why I'm selecting 340 is because our overall group here, its minimum width is 380, and I'd like to add in 20 pixels of margin on each side. So 340 plus 20 plus 20 is 380. When it comes to the height though, I actually want this to be 650 pixels, which as you'll see is actually quite long. And the reason I'm selecting that is because this is roughly the same ratio as a vertically filmed video. And so that way the video will actually fill in all of the space that's provided. I'm also just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top of this element, so that way it's not touching our file uploader. And then after adding in our video player here, what I'm going to do is just add in an input field, which will of course allow a user to upload a caption to this video post. So I'm going to scroll on down to our input forms. I'm going to yet again add in a multi-line input field here. I'm going to want this to be positioned below our video player. So I'm going to head to my layout tab, move this to the next position within our actual group, and I'll update the name of this to be called multi-line input field video post. And similar to before, I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, so that way it's fully responsive across my page. I'm also then going to set the minimum height as 50 pixels, and I'll leave the option here to fit the height of the element to the content within it. I'll also just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top while we're here, so that way it doesn't touch the video element above it there. And then finally, if I jump over to the appearance tab, I'm just going to update the placeholder text to display the words write a caption ... And now while we're working on this page, you might see that because our video player element is 650 pixels in height, it's taking up quite a bit of space on the page itself. So I'm just going to expand the height of my page. So if I was to just scroll on up and click on my overall gray page here, I'm going to head to my layout tab. I'm just going to temporarily update the minimum height to be 1500 pixels, and that's just going to give me some additional space to work with. Of course, before you publish or preview your app, you could just revert that change back to the smaller minimum height if you'd like. But the only reason I just need some additional space is because I'm just going to need to add in 2 additional elements below our multi-line input field here. So if you remember, before I'd mentioned that we can add a thumbnail image to this video post, and this is where I'm going to allow a user to upload a custom thumbnail photo. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements here, and I'm just going to add in a text element within our group here. I'm going to update the text to display the words add a thumbnail. I will then remove the style of this because I'd like to bold the format of this text, as well as align the text within the center of the element. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab, and the first thing I'm going to want to do is horizontally align that in the center of our group. I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like always, I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And because the option is selected here to fit the height of the element to the content within it, I'm going to set the minimum height as 0, and the element will collapse around the text that sits within it there. I'm also just going to move this to be the next position within my group, and I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, so that way it's not touching the actual caption input field there. And then finally, the very last thing I'll need to add is just a picture upload element, which is just going to allow a user to upload a single thumbnail image. So I'm going to scroll on down to our input fields. I will select to add in a picture uploader element, and I'm going to update the name of this to be called picture uploader video thumbnail, so that way when I'm creating a workflow in a moment, I'll know which particular picture uploader to reference. And when it comes to the formatting of this picture uploader, I'm going to horizontally align this in the center of our group. I'm going to position this in the next element in our group because I obviously want it to be the last element. And then for the width, I'm going to set the width to be 170 pixels. And I am actually going to keep this as a fixed width. I'm also going to set the height to be 250 pixels, and this will yet again be a fixed width. And the reason I'm keeping these as a fixed width is because I don't want these to be a main feature within our group. I want it to just be a small additional subsection where a user can quickly just add in a thumbnail image. The main focus itself should be on the actual video preview of this post. The only other thing I'm going to do is just add in 10 pixels of margin at the bottom of this element, so that way it has some space between this and the bottom of our overall white group. And now from here, because a user can upload a thumbnail image to our video, I'm going to click on my video player here. I'm going to head to my appearance tab, and I can now add in a dynamic thumbnail image. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and set the thumbnail image to be the value of the picture uploader video thumbnail. So that way, if the thumbnail is empty, there won't actually be an image displayed over this video. But when a user does upload a thumbnail, they'll be able to see a preview of how that thumbnail is going to look over the top of our video player here. And finally, before we close off all of the settings for this group here, I'm just going to need to add in 2 conditions into our elements, just because I'm going to need to create a way to hide this video player until a user has in fact uploaded a file. And when a file has been uploaded, I just like to hide our file uploader. And so I'm going to start by selecting on my video player here, and I'm going to head to my layout tab, and I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I'm also then going to choose the option to collapse its height when it's hidden, and that way when this is no longer visible on our page, all of the elements below will move up and take its place. I'm also then going to need to head over to my condition tab because I'm going to need to identify when in fact this video player should be visible on our page. So I'm going to define a condition, and I'm just going to recognize when the file uploader video post, so our file uploader within our group here, when its value is not empty. So that just means that when a video has in fact been uploaded into that file uploader, I'm going to select that this element should be visible and tick that that is true. And then I'm going to jump over into my file uploader here. I'm going to yet again head to my layout tab. I am going to keep this element ticked as visible on page load, but I'm also going to select the option to collapse its height when it's hidden, just so that way when this element is in fact no longer visible, I'm going to want any elements below it to move up and take its place. I'm also then going to head over to my condition tab here. I'm going to define a new condition, and I'm going to recognize when the file uploader video post, when its value is not empty, meaning when a video file has in fact been uploaded. I would like to select that this element is visible, and I am not going to tick that that should be true, just because I no longer want this element to be visible on our page. And that is the very last of the conditions we'll need to add. The last thing I want to actually add into this group is just the share text element yet again, which is going to be used to trigger a workflow. So we're going to scroll on up to our elements tree here. I'm just going to display our carousel group here. I'm going to copy the share text. I will then hide our carousel group. I will click within our video group here. I'll paste in that text. I can see it's down here. So I'm just going to need to move that up. So if I head to my layout tab, I can make this the very first element within our group. And I actually want this element to be above our file uploader. So I'm just going to hit the previous option once again. And of course, I'll just need to update the name of this to be called text share video post. And then finally, the last change I'll need to make is just by selecting on the overall group video post, I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 pixels of margin on the bottom, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that it doesn't touch the borders of our overall page. And of course, I'm also just going to need to update its settings because I'm not going to want this group to be visible as soon as the page is loaded. I'm only going to want it to be displayed when a user selects that they want to upload a video post. So I'm going to unselect that this element is visible on page load. I will collapse it when it is hidden, so that way any other groups that are being displayed move up and take its place. And it's at this point that I'm going to actually create the conditions which will allow us to hide and display each of our different groups that we've added on our page today. So I know we've already been through quite a bit in terms of adding in all of the different post functionalities. It was definitely quite overwhelming when I initially built out the first MVP of my Instagram clone. There was definitely a lot more functionality than I thought. And to be honest, it is all good and well to create a simple Instagram clone where you're just uploading a single image post. You saw how easy it was to create that. But if we want to truly try and replicate the real world product as close as we can, I think it's important to include things like carousel posts and video posts. And you'll see when we actually preview the application, these do create quite a rich experience. But at this point in time, we just need to, as I mentioned, create a way to make this menu at the top of our page functional. And the way in which we can do that is by using what's called custom states. And so if you're relatively new to Bubble, you might not be aware of what custom states are and how you can use them. Essentially, custom states are just a way to temporarily store a data value on your page or within a group. So it saves you from having to pull and store data within your database. And this is helpful for creating things like a menu here, where we just want to temporarily identify which particular type of post a user would like to publish. So if a user just wants to publish a single image post, I'd like to store a value on my page that says, hey, this user is going to just post a single image. And then I'm going to create a condition on our single image group here that's just going to recognize when the user does want to just publish a single image, this group would then be displayed. And then we're going to create the exact same experience for the additional 2 types of posts that a user can publish. And so in order to create a custom state, we're going to click on our overall page here. So this is our gray element, which is called upload. I'm then going to open up this little information icon within our element inspector. And what you'll see is the ability to add in what's called, as I mentioned, a custom state. And within our custom states, I'm essentially going to create 3. I'm going to create a state that will recognize when a user posts a single image post, as well as a carousel post, and then a video post. And so I'm going to call our first custom state display single post. And when it comes to the type of data I would like to store, I just want this to be a yes/no option. So we either are going to display the single image post group, or we aren't going to display it. I'm going to choose to create this. And now what I love is that we can also set a default value for this. And so because I would like to display a group by default as soon as the page is loaded, I'm going to set the display single post state to have a default value of yes, which in a moment I'll make sure that our group reflects that and is displayed by default as soon as the page is loaded. I'm also just going to add in 2 additional states. So there will be display carousel post. I will set this once again to be a yes/no option. I'll create this. Only this time I'm going to set the default value of this state to be no, because I won't want to display our carousel post until a user selects the option in our menu. I'll then add in a last custom state, and this will be called display video post. And this will yet again be a yes/no state type, and I'm going to set the default value of this to be no. I'm then going to close our custom state options here. And what I'd like to do now is create some workflows every single time an option is selected within our header menu here, in which case I would like to update the value of the custom state that's being stored in our page. And so I'm going to start by selecting on our post text here. I'm going to head to our appearance tab, and I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time this is clicked. And within this workflow, what I'd like to do is just type in the word state, and you'll see the option here to set the state of an element. So this is where we can update that temporary data value that's stored on our page. So whenever this post text is clicked, what I'm going to want to do is update the state that's stored on our overall page, which if you remember, our page is just called upload. The custom state I'm going to want to update is the display single post. And in this case, I just want to ensure that the value is set to yes, because in that case, the user would in fact want to display the option to upload a single image post. I'm also then just going to need to update the state of the remaining 2 options, and I'm just going to make sure that their states are in fact set to no. So I'm going to choose to set yet another state. The custom state will be the display carousel post. I'm going to set its value to be no, and then I'm going to define yet another custom state, and that will be the display video post. And in this case, I'm also going to set that to be no as well. And that's all we'll need to build out for this particular workflow here. What I am going to do though is just head over to my workflow trigger here, and I'm just going to update the event color of this workflow to be blue. And I'm going to do the same for any instance where I need to set a custom state on this page, just so that way I can differentiate between the workflows where I'm updating a custom state and the workflows I'll be adding in a moment, which will allow me to actually upload a Instagram post into my database. But from here, what I'd like to do is jump into my design tab. I'm going to select on the carousel heading option here. I'm going to then choose to start a workflow every single time this is clicked. And in order to streamline the whole process of setting my custom state, what I'm going to do is actually jump over to my initial workflow. I'm going to choose to copy the workflow step where we had set the custom states. I'm going to then jump back into my new workflow and I'm going to choose to paste that in. Only this time, I'm just going to need to update the values of the states that I'm going to be activating and turning off. So in this case, I'm going to set the display single post state to be no, because I only actually want to display the carousel post option, which just means I'm going to set the display carousel post to now be yes, and of course the display video post is still going to be set to no. I'm also then going to jump to my workflow trigger here and update the event color to be blue. And then finally, I can jump back to my design tab, select on my video text here. I'll choose to create a workflow. Within this workflow, I'm going to yet again paste the action that we had just copied before. I'm going to set the display single post option to be no. Make sure the display carousel post option is also no. And now I'll set the display video post option to be yes. I'm then going to click on my workflow trigger here and now update the event color to be blue. And now that just ensures that we have updated the state that's set in our page whenever a user selects one of our heading options. The last thing we'll need to do to make this menu functional is just add a condition onto each of our groups, which just allows them to be displayed whenever the relevant custom state is set on our overall page. So I'm going to start by selecting on our group single image post here. Now, if you remember, in our layout tab, we had unselected that this group was visible on page load. In this case, what I'm going to want to do is head over to our condition tab, and I'm going to define a new condition that recognizes when the state of our page, so if I scroll right on down to the bottom, you'll see the option to select our overall page, which of course is called the upload page. I'm going to select on that, and I'm going to recognize when the upload page, when its display single post status is in fact yes. I'm going to select that this element is visible and tick that that should be true. And of course, if you remember, by default, we had in fact set the default value of our display single post status to be yes. So that just means that as soon as the user loads this page, this group is going to be displayed. I'm then going to need to replicate the same condition across the remaining two groups on my page. And so I'm going to scroll on down to our second group here, which is our group carousel post. I'm going to define a condition here, and I'm going to recognize when the upload page, so I'm going to scroll on down, click on our page, when its display carousel post, its custom state is yes. I'm going to select that this element is visible and tick that that should be true. And then finally, I'm going to head to our video group here. I'm going to define a condition and recognize when the upload page, when its display video post custom state is in fact set to yes. I'm going to select that this element should be visible and tick that that is true. And that is how we can create a fully functional menu on our page. I will show you a quick preview of this in a moment, but I want to move on to the very last step of this module. I know it's dragged out for quite a while right now, so I definitely thank you for staying with me as we've worked through this. As I mentioned, this is by far one of the bigger modules that we're going to cover in our overall tutorial today. But essentially from here, what we're going to need to do is just create a workflow that's actually going to publish a new post within our database. And the way we're going to trigger that is by selecting on our share text here. We're going to treat that like a button. So whenever a user uploads a single post, we're going to choose to start edit a workflow. And within this workflow, we're actually going to need to add in a couple of different steps. The first step within our workflow is that I'm going to head to my data tab and I'd like to create a new thing. And now before I actually create a new post in my database, what I'm going to need to do is create the post content. So if you remember in our database, I had made the conscious effort to split the post content away from the post itself. just so that way we weren't storing so much data under the one data type, which would eventually lead to our application performing quite slowly. In this case, what I'm going to want to do is first of all create the post content, and then within our next step, I'm going to create a new post and link that post content to it. So I'm going to select by creating our post content first, which is our heavier data items. And in this case, I'm going to select that I'd like to store a caption. And the caption for this particular post will be the multi-line input single post image, its value. And then I'd also just like to store the actual image itself. So for the single image post here, I want to store the value of our picture upload a single post. And with all of the additional data fields, if we leave them blank, that's not going to make a difference. We only just need to store the data fields that are necessary for this particular post. So I'm just going to remove that option there. Once we've created the post content, as I mentioned, I'm then going to add an additional step in my workflow here. I'm going to head to my data tab. I'm going to choose to create a new thing. The thing I would now like to create is going to be the actual post itself. And then when it comes to the data fields here, the first thing I'm going to need to do is link the post content to this post itself within our database. So I'm going to select that the content data field should equal the value of the result of step 1 in our workflow. So that is the step where we actually created the post content. I'm then going to update the is single post status for this particular post. So I'm now going to set this value to equal yes, because a user is in fact publishing a single post. And that's actually all of the data fields we'll need to register under our post data type. As I mentioned, I want to try and keep this as light as possible. The very last thing I'd like to do though is redirect a user through to a home page where they can not only see their own post that they're published, but also then scroll through the feed and see the remaining list of posts that their network has published. So I'm going to add an additional step within our workflow here. I'm going to select a navigation event because I'd like to redirect a user through to a home page. I'm going to select the go to page action. And at this point in our tutorial, we haven't yet created the home page. So I'm just going to select our destination drop down here. I'm going to choose to create a new page and I'll be calling this our home page. I'll choose to create this. And I can now select that the destination page will be the new home page in which we've just created. And at this point, I won't need to send any additional data to that page. And now when it comes to uploading a carousel and a video post, the process is much the same as our single image post here. In fact, in order to streamline the whole process, I'm going to copy this overall workflow here where we had just created a single post. I'm going to paste in another version of it within our workflow editor here. And what I can do is actually update the element that's triggered whenever it's clicked that runs this workflow. In this case, I want it to be the text share carousel post. So that's just the additional share text at the top of our carousel group. And when it comes to the structure of our workflow, it's going to be much the same. The only thing we'll just need to change is the data fields that we're storing here. So I'm just going to delete these existing options here for our post content. Because when it comes to our carousel post, the first thing I'm going to store is the caption. And this is now going to be the value of the multi-line input carousel post. And then from here, I'm going to need to store a list of carousel images. And I'm going to add a list of images. And those images are, of course, the images stored within our multi-file uploader. So I'm going to scroll on down to our multi-file uploader carousel post. And this is where you can really start to see naming conventions come in handy. It's just so much easier to reference the correct input field based on the naming convention I've given it. So I'm going to select the multi-file uploader carousel post, its value, and now that's just going to store a list of all of the images uploaded to our multi-file uploader. I'm then going to jump to our create post option. The content for this post will still be the result of step 1 in our workflow. We won't need to change that. The only other thing we'll need to change here is that we're just going to need to remove this option that classifies this as a single image post. Instead, I'm just going to change the is carousel post field, and I'm going to set the value of this to be yes. And then from here, the last step will remain the same, which is where we're going to redirect a user through to our home page. And then the very last workflow we'll need to add is the ability to upload a video post. So I'm going to right click on a new workflow step and I'm going to paste in the workflow that we had copied before. I'm then going to head to the element trigger, and the trigger now is going to be the share text within our video post group. I'm going to jump to the first step in our workflow where we're creating the post content, and I'll delete the existing fields here. I'm then going to select that the caption for our video post should equal the value of our multi-line input video post, its value. Then for the actual video file, I'm going to set the value of this to be our file uploader video post. And then because we've also given the user the ability to upload a custom thumbnail image, I'm going to allow them to store that within a data field. So I'll select that the video thumbnail should equal the value of the picture uploader video thumbnail. And that's all we'll need to store for our post content. Now, when it comes to the actual post we're creating, the content will yet again be the result of step 1. We won't need to change that. The very last thing we'll need to change though is just the status of this post. I'm going to set the is video post option to be yes. And now that will recognize that as a video post within our database. And to be honest, that's everything we'll need to create on this page. This definitely was a gargantuan effort to get through this whole process. But as I said at the beginning, it is essential if you want to store multiple different types of content posts within your Instagram clone. What I'd like to do though now is just show you a quick preview of how this whole page is going to function within a preview of our application. Over in my bubble editor here, I'm just going to reduce the size of my browser so it looks roughly the same as a mobile device. And the first thing you'll notice is that on my page here, because the default custom state of our page was set to display a single image post, our group to display a single image is in fact being displayed correctly. If I'd like to ever upload a carousel post, I could select this option from our menu, and the single image group will be hidden and a carousel group will be displayed. And of course, if I'd like to upload a video post, this group will also be displayed when I select that option from our menu. In this case though, I'm just going to show you how we can upload a carousel post. So I have a couple of images here that I'm just going to drag into my multi-uploader file here. And as you'll see, once the images have successfully been uploaded, our multi-file uploader will be hidden and our repeating group will be displayed, which will now show a preview of all of these images. Which of course, because it is a horizontal scrolling repeating group, we can scroll horizontally and view all of those images. And now, of course, if I would like, I could add a caption to this post. I could say, I'm in San Francisco, and then just add in an emoji if I'd really like. I'm just going to add in the Golden Gate emoji here. And then, of course, if I'd like to publish this post, I could click on the share text here. It's going to run our workflow, and it's going to not only create a post within our database, but it's now going to redirect us through to our homepage. If you can see in the URL here, it sent us through to our homepage, which of course at this point in time, the page has nothing on it, which is why it's blank. And that's what we're going to be building out in the next step of our tutorial. One thing I would just like to point out though is that this page we've just built is completely responsive across a mobile device. So if I was to just show you a quick little preview in the corner of my screen here of what it looks like on a mobile device, you'll see that it's fully functional and it allows a user to access their own camera roll. And because we are building this application within the Flexbox responsive engine, it's quite easy to make the actual page responsive across any device, whether that be desktop or mobile. At this point in our tutorial, I want to move along to one of the main features that our users are going to be interacting with throughout our Instagram application. And that is, of course, the homepage feed, where they're going to see a list of not only the post of the people who they're following within our application, but also just a list of their own posts whenever they publish something. And of course, if you're familiar with the real-world Instagram product, this is one of the most important features that you're going to build out throughout the process. So let's just dive into our bubble editor over here, and I can start walking you through the process of creating our home page. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my page drop down here and open up my home page that I have created within my application. And at this point, I'd just like to point out that our home page is currently blank. There should be nothing on it. I've just jumped ahead and I've updated this to be the Flexbox responsive engine. So if you haven't done that, you'll also just need to pause the tutorial and make sure you've upgraded that. Like always, the first thing I'm going to do on this page is I'm going to update the background color just to be a light shade of gray for the time being. just so that way while I'm working on the page, I can see where the constraint of it sits within my overall bubble editor here. And then from here, I'm going to open up my element inspector by double clicking on the page. I'm then going to head over to my layout tab here. And before I update the actual width of the page, I'm going to need to set the container layout of this page. And in this case, I'd like the container layout to be a column because I'm going to be stacking elements from top to bottom across our page. And so I'm going to select that option. I'd then like to update the preset width of the page to be the mobile size. And that's going to reduce the page to be 380 pixels in width. And what I'm also going to do while we're here is I'm just going to update the minimum height of the page just to be 1500 pixels for the time being. And that's going to make it quite long, as you can see. But we can always come back and update this at a later point in time when we either preview or publish our application. The reason I'm just extending out the height of the page is just because I want a bit of room to add in the actual feed itself that users are going to engage with. And now when it comes to building out our home page, the very first thing I'd like to do is just add in a header menu across the top of our page here. And so in order to do that, because I'm going to want to add elements in horizontally across my page, I'm going to need to add in a group element, and I'll be updating its container layout to not be a column, but instead be a row. So while our page's container layout is a column, it's going to stack elements on the page from top to bottom. What we can do is we can choose to add in a group onto our page, and any elements that sit within this group are going to be stacked horizontally. So they'll be side by side. Before we do that though, I'm just going to take the time to update the name of this group to be called group header menu. And so that way I can just reference where it is on my page at any given point in time. I'm then going to jump over to my appearance tab here, and I'm just going to remove the style of this group. And now when I'm working with the new Bubble Flexbox responsive engine, I personally just like to color code my groups in different shades of different colors, just so that way I can easily identify what groups belong to which section of my page. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the background style of this group to be a flat color, but I'm not going to leave it at white. I'm going to set the background color here to be a light shade of red. Of course, when I publish my application, I can remove this background color if I would like. But for the time being, while we're actually building our application, I'd recommend just color coding your groups that you add on your page. In my mind, it just creates a nice visual representation of where everything sits. It's kind of like building with Lego blocks in a way on your page. It just makes it easier to follow. What I'm then going to do is head over to my layout tab for this group, because as I'd mentioned, I'm going to need to update the container layout of this group to be a row, not a column. Because with a row, it will allow me to stack elements side by side, so horizontally. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width at infinite. And of course, if I was to open up my responsive preview here, that's just going to show you that this group will either expand or retract regardless of the device size that a user is viewing this page on. If I just jump back into my UI builder here though, what we can then do is start to add in all of the elements that will be positioned within our overall header menu here. And the first is that I would like to add an element which is just going to be a heading, and that heading is just going to display the word Instagram. So I'm going to add in a visual element here, which is just going to be a text element. And so I'm going to update this text and it will just display the word Instagram. And when it comes to the style of this element, I'm just going to choose to remove the style here, because I'd like to update the default font of this particular text element. In this case, I'm going to search for the font Coragetti, which is just the same font that I used on my user registration page. In my opinion, it looks quite similar to the actual branding that Instagram uses on their fonts. And then while we're here, I'm also just going to update the font size here to be 26, and that's just going to enlarge the text within our overall element. I'm also then going to need to just update the responsive settings of this text element itself. So I'm going to head over to my layout tab here, and I'm going to start by unselecting that this element should be fixed width. I'm then going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So like always, regardless of the page size, whether it be as small as possible or as large as possible, this text element will expand across whatever space it can. And then from here, I'm also just going to set the minimum height to be 0, and that way it's going to collapse quite nicely around my text there. And then finally, I'm also just going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left, just to ensure that my text element doesn't touch the left-hand side of this red group here. And now beside this text element on the right-hand side, I would like to add in 3 different icon elements that will be used to navigate us between 3 different pages. There's going to be an upload icon, a notification heart icon, as well as a message icon, which will direct a user to our inbox page. And in order to position this text element on the left-hand side, and then also a cluster of icons on the right-hand side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to actually add in another group within my overall red group here. And I'll explain why I'm doing that in a moment, but the first thing I'd like to do is just make sure that this new group we've added is visible within our red group. And so as I mentioned, what we're going to do is we're going to treat these like Lego blocks. We're going to head to our Appearance tab here. We're going to remove the style of it. I'm just going to set a flat background color here, and I'm happy to leave it as white in this instance. And then if I jump over to my Layout tab here, I'm going to update the container layout here to be a row, because within this group, I'm going to place 3 individual icons side by side. And so I'm obviously going to want to stack those horizontally, which means my container layout will need to be a row. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And what you'll now see is that this group will be positioned directly beside our text element. Only in this case, as you can see, it's on the wrong side of our text element. As I mentioned, I want that to be on the right side of our red group. So if I was to head to my layout tab here, which I'm already in, I can just move this to be the next element within my overall red group. And it's just going to push that to the side. And now within this particular group here, I'm going to add in my 3 different icon elements. And now you can start to see how these elements are going to be positioned on either side of our overall header menu. So what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to head to my visual elements, and I'm going to grab an icon element. And the icon I'm going to be adding, I'm just going to type in the word plus, and I'm just going to choose this plus icon here. And now when it comes to the styling of this icon, I just like to edit the overall style, just because I'm going to choose to reference the color that I'm going to change this to for every single icon I add within our application. So I'm going to choose to edit the standard icon style here, and I'm going to just update the color. I'm going to paste in a darker shade of gray or black. And if you'd like that color code, it's 424242. I'm then going to jump back into my design tab here, and now I'll just need to update the actual size of this icon. And in order to do that, I'm going to head to our layout tab here. I'm going to update the width of this to be 30 pixels. And I'm also going to update the height to also be 30 pixels. And now one thing I'd just like to point out is that I'd like to leave this icon as a fixed width as well as a fixed height. Because regardless of how big the page becomes, I'd like this icon to always remain 30 pixels in width and 30 pixels in height. The only other thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to vertically align this icon into the center of our white group here, which just ensures that it's always going to be positioned in the center. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to make a copy of this icon, and I'm just going to need to update the icon that's displayed itself. I'm happy with the rest of the styling. What I'm going to do here is just search for a heart icon, and I'm going to select this empty heart icon there. Because we've already updated the style of the icon, we don't need to make any additional changes. And then finally, I'm going to make one last copy of this icon. Only in this case, the icon I would like to display is just going to be this comment icon. So if you type in the word comment, you'll see the option here to select from one of these choices. And I'm just going to choose this option here. And now you'll see that we have 3 individual icons which are going to be used as our navigation menu. But at this point in time, these icons are pretty much clustered side by side together, whereas I'd actually like these to be spread evenly across the white group that they sit within. And so in order to update that, I'm going to click on the white group itself, and I'm going to head to the layout tab here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the container alignment of this group. So this will just determine where all of the elements that sit within this group will be positioned. At the moment, you can see they're positioned on the left-hand side. If I wanted to align them in the center, it would position them all together in the center. But what I want to create is an experience where all of these elements have an equal amount of space around them, which is where the space around option can come into play. So if we select this option here, which says space around, it's going to add in an even amount of space around our icons, as well as an even amount of space between our icons. and it just saves us having to play around with any margins for these individual icons. The only thing I will point out though is that, as you can see, because our white group is taking up half of our overall header menu here, there is quite a bit of space between each of these icons, whereas I'd actually like these to be a little bit closer together. And as a solution to this, what I can do is actually just set a maximum width on our white group here. So if I click on our group and open up our layout tab, I can just type in that I'd like to give this a maximum width of 140 pixels. There's no particular reason why I'm selecting 140. It's just a good size that leaves a even amount of space between each of these elements where they're not too spread out. While we're here though, what I am going to do now is also update the minimum height. I'm going to set this to be 0. And what you'll find is that now the group itself is going to collapse around the icon elements that sit within it. And then finally, I would also like to vertically align this white group in the center of my overall red group. So that just ensures that at all given times, this group is going to be positioned within our overall header menu. And I'm going to do the same for our text element here. I'm going to click on this and vertically align that in the center. And then from here, I can click on our overall header menu group, and I'm going to update the minimum height of this to now be 0. And because we have the option ticked here to fit the height of the element to the content within it, it's going to collapse quite nicely around all of the additional elements that sit within it. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top of this group here, just so that way it's not directly touching the very top border of our page. But as you can see, that's how we can actually build a header menu within not only our homepage in our Instagram application, but any page you would like to build within Bubbles Editor. Of course, as you can see, we used a combination of different group elements, and I made sure to color code these throughout the process, so that way we could easily identify which groups lie in which positions on our overall page. From here though, now what I would like to build out is the main homepage feed itself, which is going to display a list of all of the posts that a user can interact with within our Instagram clone. And the way in which I'm going to display a list of posts is by using what's called a repeating group element. So if I was to scroll on down to our containers menu here, I'm going to add in a repeating group element. And if you're not too familiar with repeating groups, they're a way to dynamically display a list of information stored within your database. So in our Instagram clone today, we're going to display a list of Instagram posts that users have published. And as you can see here, a repeating group displays a list of different cells, and each one of these cells will represent an individual post that's been published into our application. So this cell here is going to display the very first post that's relevant to a user. The second one will display the second cell. The third one will be the third, and so on. And in order to determine what type of content we would like to pull from our database and display dynamically within this repeating group, we're going to first need to head over to our Appearance tab before we can update the formatting and the layout of this repeating group itself and make it look pretty. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to identify what type of content we'd like to display a list of from our database. And in this case, I'd like to display a list of Instagram posts. And so now that we've identified that we want to display a list of Instagram posts, we just need to tell Bubble which particular post we're going to want to display. So we're not going to want to display every single post to a user. Instead, we only want to display a list of posts that have been published by the people that a user follows. And so when it comes to our data source here, what we're going to need to do is determine what data our repeating group needs to pull and display from our database. So we're going to perform a search through our database for all of the Instagram posts where the person who created them, so I'm going to search through the created by field, when the person who created it is in the current users list of users that they follow. So the people who the current user is following. And now what that's going to do is it's going to display a list of posts published by people who the user is actively following. And in the case of our Instagram clone today, I'd like to display the most recent posts first. So I'm going to choose to sort these by their creation date. So I'll sort it by the created date field and set the descending value to be yes. If you really wanted, you could sort these randomly, or you could even try and create your own little algorithm if you'd like. I'm just going to keep it nice and simple for the time being though. But what we're also going to need to do is create a way to merge in all of the posts that a user has published themselves. Because when a user publishes a post, we'll also display it in the homepage feed so that way they can see that post. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this initial search here, and I'm going to select the more option within my data source. And if I was to just type in the word merge, you'll see an option here to merge this particular search with something else. And so what I want to do is, first of all, pull all of the posts from my database that were published by someone who the user is following. And then I want to merge it with all of the posts that the current user has published themselves. And so I'm then going to perform another search here, and I'm going to merge our first search with a second one. And I'm going to search for yet again a list of Instagram posts. Only this time I'm going to be searching for posts where the created by person equals the current user. So that is the person who's logged in and viewing their own homepage feed. I'm then going to also sort these by the created date, and I'll set the descending value to be yes. So that way the most recent posts are shown and displayed at the top of the repeating group. I'm then going to choose to close our search there, and that's all we're going to need to configure for our data source in this repeating group. And now when it comes to the actual layout of our repeating group here, the first thing I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows. And what that just means is that regardless of how many posts our Instagram application needs to display, this repeating group is going to continually expand downwards and display all of those posts. So essentially it's just going to create a never-ending feed. And so while the repeating group itself only displays 4 cells at the moment, it's going to indefinitely display as many posts that fit into the criteria of our data source here. And this is where you can start to see the power of repeating groups come into play. They just allow you to build very powerful experiences like a homepage feed that we're creating today. The only thing I'd just like to do for the time being is just update the minimum height of each row. I'm just going to set this to be 400 pixels. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter what height you add into this. The only reason I'm doing this is because I just want to expand the height of each cell, just so I have a bit more room to work within. When I am working with repeating groups though, I do also like to add a solid border around it. So if I was to click away at the moment, you can't really see where the repeating group sits on my page. So what I'm going to do is select on my repeating group, I'm going to remove the style, and if I scroll on down, I'm going to add a solid border to this repeating group. So now if I was to click away, I can at least see where the border of the repeating group sits on my page. I'm then going to select the repeating group once again. And now we're just going to need to update the responsive settings of it before we then start to add in all of the content of an Instagram post. And so I'm going to jump to my layout tab here. And the first thing I'm going to need to do is set the container layout of our repeating group. And now for every Instagram post, I'm going to start by displaying things like the name and the profile photo of the person who published it, followed by the actual post. And then I'm going to display some icons like a like icon or a comment where someone can engage with the post. And the way I'm going to be stacking these elements is going to be vertically, not horizontally. So I'm going to be building it from top to bottom, which means that my container layout will need to be a column. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width to be infinite. And if I was to jump over into my responsive editor here, what you'll now see is that this repeating group as well as our header menu are going to be completely responsive regardless of which device a user is viewing our application on. The other thing I should point out is that in our appearance tab for our repeating group, although I had set a minimum height of 400 pixels, just so I had more room to work within, I set a fixed number of columns to be 1. So that way there's only going to be one Instagram post on each particular cell in our repeating group. There's not going to be a grid of posts. When we create a grid of posts on our user profile page later on, I'll be explaining when we can customize this field here. But from here, what I'd like to do is start adding in all of the elements within our repeating group. And then later on, we're going to come back and we're going to update the rest of these responsive settings here. But before we do that, we'll just need to add in all of the content we'd like to display for each Instagram post. And as I mentioned, the very first thing I'd like to display is going to be the profile photo and the name of the person who has published this post. And because I'd like to stack these side by side, we're going to need to add in yet another group within our overall repeating group. And I'm going to set the container layout to be a row, so that way I can position them horizontally. So if I head to my containers menu here, I'm going to add a row into our existing repeating group. And because I want to easily determine where this group's going to sit within my repeating group, I'm going to head to my appearance tab here, and I'm just going to remove the style of this group. I'll then set the background color just to be a flat color. I can then jump over to my layout tab, and I'm just going to need to update the responsive settings of this group before I can start adding my elements into it. So as I mentioned, because I want to add a profile photo on the left-hand side and then the user's handle on the right-hand side, I'm going to need to set the container layout to be a row because I want to stack those horizontally. I'm then going to jump to my width of this group. I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width because I'll also want this group to be responsive within our overall repeating group. I'll then set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So that way, regardless of how small or how large the page becomes, this group will always remain responsive. And before I update the height settings, I'm just going to add in the actual image and the text I'd like to display itself. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements, and the first thing I'm going to add in is an image. So I'm going to add that within our overall group here. And now what I'd like to do is display the profile photo of the person who has published this Instagram post within our repeating group cell. And we can do that by inserting dynamic data. But because this image element actually sits within our group, it technically doesn't sit directly within our overall repeating group here, which just means that it's unable to pull data from our repeating group at this current point in time. And so in order to pass data from my repeating group through to my actual white group here, what I'm going to need to do is select on my white group, and I'm just going to need to set a type of content for this group. I'd like this to also be an Instagram post. And then the data that it pulls through, I would like it to be the data of the current cell's post. So that is the cell of our repeating group it sits within. So if it sits within cell number 1 of our repeating group, it's going to pull through the data of post number 1. If it's in cell 2, it'll pull through the data of post 2. And now if I was to select on my image, what I can do is insert dynamic data, and I can pull the data that we just referenced in our group element. And because our image element sits within the group is now referred to as the parent. So I'm going to select to display the parent group's post, which the parent group is of course pulling through data from our repeating group as well. I'm going to display the creator of that post, so the person who published it. I'd like to display their profile photo. And just a personal preference of mine is that I also like to process this image with Imgix, which is just an extension that allows me to crop the dimensions of this image by selecting this option. And when we preview our post, you'll just see it just makes sure that the image fits within the overall size of the image element itself. But of course, I don't want the image element to be this big. I just want it to be a small circle within our group. So I'm going to scroll on down to the styling option within our image here, and I'm going to set the roundness of this image to be 100, so that way it's a perfect circle. But what I'd also like to do while I'm just working on my image for the time being is set a solid border around this image, so that way I can actually see where it sits within my group once I click away. And then from here, I'm just going to click on my image again and jump to my layout tab, because I'd like to update the size of this image. And when it comes to this image, I'm just going to update this to be 50 pixels, and I will be keeping this as a fixed width, just because I will always want this image to be 50 pixels in width, regardless of how big the page is. I don't want it to scale up or down based on the page size. What I'm also going to do is just tick this box here to keep this aspect ratio fixed for this element. And if the aspect ratio is 1:1, it's just going to be a perfect square there. And finally, when it comes to the actual position of this image, I won't want this to touch the borders of my page. So I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, and 10 on the left. I won't add 10 on the right because I'll add the margin on the left-hand side of the element that sits beside this. But I'll also just vertically align this element in the center of our white group. So that way, regardless of its height, it's always just going to be positioned in the center. What I'm then going to do is add in a text element into our group. And this is going to display the name of the person who has published this post, or I should say their username or handle. And in order to display that, I'm just going to insert dynamic data and once again choose from the parent group's post, the person who created that post. I would like to display their username. And now I'd also like this text to be bold. So I'm going to remove the style of it, and I'm going to select that this should be bold formatting. I'll then jump over into my layout tab so I can update the responsive settings here. And I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And so that way, regardless of how long the user's handle is, this element will be completely responsive and fit that text in. I'm also going to set the minimum height as 0, making sure that the element sits nicely around the text within it. And then from here, I'm going to vertically align this in the center, so that way it sits directly beside our image. And of course, I just like to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, 10 on the left, and also 10 on the right, just because I won't want this text to touch the right-hand border of my page. And once I've finished adding these elements into my overall repeating group, I can select on the group that they sit within. I'm going to jump to its layout settings, and I'm then going to set the minimum height to be 0, which just means that it's going to now collapse nicely around all of our elements there. And you can start to see this is how our Instagram post is going to start coming together within our application. One thing I might like to do is just select on my overall repeating group here. I'm just going to jump to my layout tab because I'd like to just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top here. So that way our very first Instagram post isn't going to be touching the borders of our menu as well. And now from here, what I'd like to do is display the actual content of the Instagram post itself. And because my application today is going to support multiple different types of posts, so things like single image posts, carousels, as well as video posts, we're going to need to create 3 different ways to display 3 different types of content. And this is where things can start to get a little bit more complex. And it's definitely not essential to create and support 3 different types of post types. But I just think if we're going to try and build a Instagram clone today, I want to try and replicate as many as the real world features as possible. And essentially what we're going to do today is create a way to identify what particular post type each individual post is. So for instance, if this post here was a single image post, I'm going to add an image element onto our repeating group here. And if it is a single image post, I'd like that image element to be displayed. But let's say if a user published a carousel post, I'd like to identify that it is in fact a carousel post. And instead of displaying that single image element, I'd like to display a repeating group with a list of image elements. And the same will apply to our video post. And so this is where things can get a little bit confusing just around hiding and displaying certain groups and elements. But I'm going to walk you through this in as much detail as you need throughout the process. The first thing we're going to cater for is just a way to display single image posts. So the way I'm going to create this is by first of all heading to my containers menu, and I'm going to add a group element into my existing repeating group. When it comes to this group here, I'm actually going to update the name of this to be called group single image post, just so that way once we hide and display it, we know which group we're referencing at any given time. When it comes to the appearance of this group, I'm also going to remove the style. I'm going to set a flat background color. Only this time, I'm just going to select to make this a light shade of green. You can make this whatever color you want. It doesn't really matter. The only reason I'm adding this as a green color is because I'm just going to easily be able to identify that this green group here belongs to my single image posts. And in a moment, I'm going to add just a single image element into it. But before I do that, I'm going to head to my layout tab here, and I'm going to update the container layout to be a row. And now, although I am only adding in one element into this, which is just going to be a single image element, if I set the container layout to be a row, the row container layout is just going to give me some extra customization features in making sure that my image element sits both horizontally and vertically in the center of my green group. But I'll get to that in a moment. What I am going to need to do though is unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width to be infinite, like always. And that's going to make this group fully responsive across my page. And then from here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add in that image element that's going to display a single image post. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements here. I'm going to add in an image element. And when it comes to the actual image I would like to display, I'm yet again going to need to feed some data through to my green group here, so I can pass that on to my image element. Only in this case, when it comes to the green group, I'm going to set the type of content to not be a post, but to be a post content. Because you might remember that when we are creating an Instagram post, we have separated the larger data fields, so things like the actual post images and videos, from the post itself. And this is where we're going to start referencing to display the post content. And so I'm going to set the type of content to be post content. And then for the data source, because we had linked post content to a data field for our individual post in our repeating group, I can easily just display the current sales post, its linked post content here, and that's just going to pass that data through, which now means in my image element here, for its dynamic image, I can insert dynamic data, and display the parent group's post content, remembering that the parent group is my green group here that's now fetching data from my repeating group. I'm going to display its single image, which is just the data field that's going to store the value of a single image post. If I'd really like, I could also just add a solid border around this image, just so I can see where it sits within my green group. But from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually select on this image here. I'm going to jump to my layout tab. And the first thing I'm going to do is just vertically align this image in the center of my green group. I'm then going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And I'm going to leave the minimum width at 320 pixels and the maximum width at 80 pixels. And the reason why I'm leaving the minimum width at 0 is because within my responsive engine here, the smallest possible mobile device size is 320 pixels. And when it comes to the image, I don't want it to get any smaller than that. So that's why I'm not setting the image as 0 like I would normally do for other elements. The only other thing as well is that I'd like to set the minimum height to now be 320 pixels. And the reason why I'm selecting 320 for the height is because at minimum, I'm going to want this image to be a square. And so if the width is 320, the height should at minimum also be 320. But if I leave the maximum height as infinite, this image will indefinitely scale based across our page and take up whatever space it needs. I'm going to jump back into my UI builder here though, and I'm just going to need to update some final responsive settings within the green group that this image sits within. And now because our image actually covers up our green group, the way in which we can access that within its element inspector is just by right clicking on the image here. And I'm going to select to pull up the first parent. And if you remember, the parent is the green group that our image sits within. So you can see here we have the group single image post. I'm going to jump to my layout tab now though, and I just want to make sure the container alignment of this image is always in the center of this green group. And then finally, I'm just going to set the minimum height of this group to be 0, just because we have the option selected here to fit the height of the element to the content within it. And then finally, the very last thing I'd like to change within this particular group is just a way to only display this group whenever a user has in fact published a single image post. Because I obviously won't want this group and this image to be displayed if a user posts something like a carousel or a video. And so in order to do that, I'm going to select on our layout tab for our group single image post here. I'm going to untick the option that makes this group visible on page load. And I'm also just going to select the option to collapse this element's height when it's hidden, which just means that this element is no longer going to be visible on our page unless I create a condition that allows it to be displayed. And when this group is hidden, any other elements below it will move up and take its place. And if we'd like to display that group once again on our page, we can head over to our elements tree up here, and I can see that our group is grayed out there. So if I just click on the eye icon, it's going to add that group back onto my page. Now what I'll need to do from here is of course create a condition that just recognizes when this group should in fact be displayed. And that is of course when a user has published a single image post. So I'm going to define a condition here, and I'm just going to recognize when the current cells post within our repeating group, when it is single post, its status is yes. I'm going to select that this element is visible, and I'm going to tick that that should be true. So now this group is only going to be displayed whenever a user has in fact published a single image post. From here, we're just going to need to then create a way to identify if the post is a carousel post type. And if that is the case, I'd like to display a list of images, not just a single image. And the way in which we can do that is very much the same as displaying a single image here. What I'm going to do is just choose to hide this group for our single image within our repeating group. And then I'm going to add in yet another group within our repeating group here. I'm going to update the name of this to be called group carousel post. I'm then going to jump to our appearance tab here, and I'm going to first of all remove the style of this group. I would like to set the background color to be a flat color. And in this case, I'm just going to make this group a light shade of yellow, just so that way I can identify that my yellow group is where I'm going to store and display my carousel post. While we're here, I'm also just going to set the type of content to once again be a post content. And I'm just going to pull the data from our repeating group cell that it sits within. So for our data source, this will just be the current cell's post. It's linked content that we've stored in our database. And then finally, I'm just going to jump over to our layout tab here. I'm going to set the container layout to be a row yet again, just like our previous group. And for the time being, I'm going to unselect that this is a fixed width. And I'll just make sure that I have the minimum width here set to 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And we'll come back at a later point in time to update the rest of the settings. But what we'll need to do is essentially build out a repeating group element that's going to display a list of posts for our carousel. And in fact, the easiest way to build this is just by duplicating the carousel that we had created on our upload page. And so if we were to jump over to the upload page within our application here, we've already done the hard work in terms of creating a carousel within a repeating group. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. We can just modify what we've already created. So we're going to scroll on up to our elements tree here, and you'll see the group that displays our carousel post. We're going to select the eye icon and make that visible. And now within that, you'll see that we have our hidden repeating group. We're also going to click its eye icon and make it visible. I'm then going to click on the repeating group itself and choose to make a copy of that. I'll then jump over into my home page, and I'll click into my yellow group here, and I'll paste in my repeating group. And now by default, that repeating group that we've just copied across still has the same conditions as it had on our upload page when we had copied it. So by default, it's not going to be visible on our page. So we'll once again need to head to our elements tree here. I can see we've got our repeating group carousel preview. I'm going to click on the eye icon, and now you'll see it's visible within our overall yellow group. The first thing I'm going to do is just head to our condition tab and just remove that condition we had previously added onto it. And now once I've removed that condition, this repeating group is now going to be visible on my page. What I'd also just like to do is head over to my appearance tab, just because I'll need to update the data source. So in this case, I still want to display a list of images. However, the data source is going to be the parent group's post content. And the parent group is, of course, the yellow group that our repeating group now sits within. I'm going to display its list of carousel images. And then for the minimum height and width of each row in our repeating group, I'm going to set this to be 340 pixels. And then I'll set the width to also be 340 pixels. And the reason why I've selected 340 pixels is because the page itself, its width is 380 pixels. And similar to when I explained before, with a carousel image, I don't want each cell to take up the full width of the page. I actually want to create an experience where you can actually see the beginning of the second cell. So that way it just indicates to a user that this is in fact a carousel post, and it will prompt them to continually scroll across. What I will need to do though is head over into my layout tab here, and I'm just going to need to update the minimum height to also be 340 pixels. And now that's just going to fit in the image within our repeating group. And of course, I'll also just need to update the size of this image here. And when it comes to the dimensions of this image, I'm going to leave the minimum and maximum width as 0 and infinite. And then when it comes to the height of this repeating group here, I'm going to set the minimum height itself to be 340 pixels. And then I'm just going to also remove the margins from all around this image here. So I'm just going to delete these. And what you'll now find is that our image will stretch out to be the complete height and width of our repeating group that it sits within. The only thing I'd also like to just change is that if I select on the overall repeating group itself, I can just see from our previous page where we copied it, it just had a top margin of 10 pixels. So I'm just going to delete that down there. And what you'll now see is that this carousel fits quite nicely on our overall repeating group of our Instagram post. But finally, the last thing we'll need to edit for this group is just a way to either hide or display this based on whether or not this post within our Instagram clone is a carousel or not. So I'm going to select on our repeating group here, and then I'm going to need to select on the yellow group that it sits within. So I'm going to click on the right hand side of my repeating group cell. I'm then going to right click and choose to select its first parent. So at this point in time, I've selected the yellow group, which is my group carousel post. And before I add in that condition, I'm just going to set the minimum height here to be 0, just because we have the option selected here to fit the height of this element to all of the content within it. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I'll choose to collapse this element's height when it's hidden. And so at this point, this element is not visible. I'm then going to need to jump to my conditional tab here, and I'll define a condition which will just recognize when the current cell's post when it is carousel post status equals yes, I'm going to say that this element is visible and tick that that should be true. And that is how we can display a list of images if the post itself is in fact a carousel. The only last group we'll need to add in is a way to determine if a post is a video post, in which case I'd like to display a video file. And so I'm just going to head to my elements tree here, and I'm going to click the eye icon next to my carousel post group, which is just going to hide it for the time being, because I just like to add in one final group here. So I'm going to head to my containers, I'll add in a group. I'm then going to update the name of this group to be called group video post. And then when it comes to the appearance of this group, the first thing I'm going to do is just remove the style, just because I'd like to give it a flat color as the background color there. I'm going to set this to be a, let's say, I'll just make this red again. So I'll just make this a light shade of red. I'm then going to need to update the type of content here. I would like this to be a post content yet again, because it's going to pull the value of the current cell's repeating group post it sits within, its content that we've linked to it in our database. And then just quickly, I'm going to update some of the responsive settings. The first one will of course be the container layout. I'll set that to be a row. And then I'm only going to update the width of this for the time being. I'm just going to make sure the minimum width is 0, the maximum width is infinite. So that way if my page scales out or shrinks, it's always going to be completely responsive. And now the only element I'd like to add within this group is just going to be a video player, which is just going to obviously play a video post. And so I'm going to head to my visual elements. And if you remember at this point in our tutorial, we had installed a HTML5 video player. I'm just going to reference that video player element here. And then I'm going to head to my layout tab of my video player, and I'm going to update the width to be 380 and then the height to be 650. And the reason why I've selected these dimensions is that I've just experimented around, and these look to be the size of a vertical video that you would record and publish on Instagram. Of course, as I'd mentioned in our previous module, at this point in time, it's not possible to create a completely responsive experience with our video player. But hopefully within the matter of a few months, Bubble will give plugins the ability to create completely responsive features. So if that was the case, you could just set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width to be infinite, as well as the height. And then this video player would continually just expand based on how much room is needed for the video it needs to play. What I'm going to do though is just head over to my appearance tab here, just because I am going to need to reference which particular video I would like to display within this video player. And this is nice and simple. I'm going to click on the dynamic link here. I will insert dynamic data, and I would like to display the parent group's post content. It's a video file. I would like to pull from it the URL of that video file itself. And then when it comes to the thumbnail image, I would like to display the thumbnail image that was uploaded when this video was published. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'll be displaying yet again the parent group's post content, the video thumbnail for that. And that's everything I'll need to customize for our video player. The only other thing I might like to do is just add a solid border around this, just so I can see where it sits within my group. But when it comes to the group itself, what I'm going to need to do is just create a condition that once again hides or displays this group based on whether or not this is a video post. So at this point in time, our video is actually overlaid over the top of our group. So I'm just going to right click on this and select its first parent, which will now highlight my red group I've added onto the page. Like always, I'm going to jump to my layout tab here. I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. Then I'm going to choose to collapse this element's height when it's hidden. I'm then going to need to jump to my conditional tab, and I'll just need to recognize if the current cell's post, if it's is video post status is in fact yes, I'm going to select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. And just like that, that's how we can add in 3 different groups to determine 3 different types of media that can be shared across our Instagram clone today. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to choose to hide this group for the time being though, just because below every single post, what I'd like to do is add in our engagement icons. So things like a like icon, a comment icon, as well as the description or caption that was published for each individual post. And in comparison to what we've just went through, that's a relatively straightforward process. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by adding in a list of icons below our actual post. And I'm going to want to display this horizontally like we had done for the icons in our header menu. And so in order to do that, of course, I'm going to need to add in yet another group within my existing repeating group. And so this is important that I add the group within the repeating group itself, not outside of it. And that's why I like to add a solid border around my repeating group so I can see where it sits on my page at all times. What I'm going to do is head over to my appearance tab here. I'm just going to remove the style of this and set the background to be a flat color. I'm happy to leave it as white for the time being. And then I'm going to jump over to my layout tab here. I'm going to update the container layout to be a row because I'll be positioning elements in this horizontally. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, so that way this group is responsive at all times. And now within this group, it's going to actually follow a similar experience to our header menu. What I'm going to want to do is split it into two different sides. On one side here, I'm going to have a like icon, a comment icon, and then a send icon. And then on the right hand side, I'm just going to have a bookmark icon. And in order to streamline this whole process, I'm actually going to copy the existing icons we've added into our header menu here. So I'm just going to copy this group and I'm going to paste it into my white group here. And now because we have two white backgrounds, I'm going to need to change the color of one. I might actually change the color of my overall group here. So I just jump to my appearance tab. I can just set this to be an orange background. I'll just update the color there. Perfect. And to streamline the whole process, I'm just going to need to update the icons that are displayed themselves. So for the first icon, I'll want this to be the heart icon. For the second icon, I'll want that to in fact be the comment icon. I'm just going to select this comment icon with no speech bubbles in it. And then finally for the third icon, I'll just type in that I want this to be a paper plane. And then finally, I'd also just like to add another icon that's going to be positioned on the very far right hand side of this group. So I'm just going to choose to copy this icon. I'll then select my orange group and choose to paste this in. So now it's going to be outside my existing group there. I'm then going to have this icon be a bookmark. So I'm just going to type in the word bookmark. I can select from a bookmark icon here. And now in order to spread these icons out across our overall group, I'm going to click on the orange group itself. I'll head to the layout tab here, and I would like to set this option to be the space between option. And what that's going to do is it's just going to push each of my elements to each individual side of the group that they sit within here. And then while we're working on this group here, what I would like to do is just update the minimum height to be 0. And because we've selected the option here to fit the height of this group to the content within it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of those elements. Only what you'll see is that these are quite tight here around all of my elements. So I might just click on my bookmark here. I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin on the bottom. And because my overall orange group here is positioned around the height of the content within it, the margin here is just going to push that group up and down. So that way it doesn't touch the borders of all of the elements that sit within it. And that's just going to create a bit of space between all of my elements on the page. Once we've added our group with all of our icon elements into our overall repeating group here, I'd just like to add a few additional text elements below this, and they're going to display things like the total like count for this post, as well as the actual caption of the post itself. And now at this point in time, one thing I should just point out is that when it comes to our repeating group, we've well and truly filled it in with additional elements. So it might just be hard to drag an element into the repeating group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select on our orange group here. I'm just going to head to our layout tab and I'm just going to choose to add in 30 pixels of margin at the top. And it's just going to add in some additional space within my repeating group cell. And then I'm going to head over to my visual elements here and I'm just going to drag a text element into my repeating group. I can see it's actually dragged it below my repeating group. So I'm just going to move that up into my repeating group. Once again, didn't get it in the right spot. I'd added it into my group there. But I can now finally see that this is in fact within my repeating group. If I would like to double check to make sure that that is true, I could right click on this element and choose to select its first parent. And as you can see, because it now sits within my repeating group, it's pulled up all the information within my element inspector. What I would like to do though is I'm going to select on this text element and I'm going to head to our layout tab. I'm just going to move this down to be the next item within my repeating group cell. And then what I'd also like to do is just unselect that this element should be fixed width. Like always, I'll be setting the minimum width as 0. I'll leave the maximum width as infinite. And then I'll set the minimum height to also be 0, because of course we have this option selected here to fit the height of the element to the content within it. And then while we're here, I'm also just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top of this text element, 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And now when it comes to the actual text itself that is displayed within this element, I'm going to jump to our appearance tab, and I'm going to have this display the words liked by, and then I'd like to add in the total count of likes that this particular post has received. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current sales post, its likes, which if you remember in our database is a list of users. And so because we have a list of users, I'm just going to want to perform a count on how many users are within that list. So I'm going to choose the count option. Then I'm going to add a space and just type in the word users. I'm then going to open up my rich text editor here, which will allow me to just update the formatting of any particular text. And I'm just going to highlight that dynamic string I've added in there. So the current sales post likes, its count. I'm just going to choose to bold that text and nothing else. So that way it's just going to bold that particular number and nothing else. And now once we've added this text element in, I'd like to just make a copy of this. So I'm going to choose to copy that, paste it in, and it'll paste in another text element below that within our repeating group cell. I'm then going to just backspace all of this text here. And in this case, I'm going to first of all want to display the username of the person who's created this post, followed by the actual caption that they've published within this post. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current sales post, the creator of this post, their username, and then I'm going to add in a space, and I'm going to insert more dynamic data. And from here, I'm going to display the current sales post, the content of that post, which is our linked data type, and then I'm going to display the caption that was stored within that. And when it comes to the formatting of this text, I will open up our rich text editor once again, and I'm just going to highlight the dynamic text that displays the user's username. I'll choose to bold that. I'll then save this element here. And then finally, I'm just going to make one last copy of this text element. I will yet again just remove all of this text here, and I'm just going to display how many comments this post has received. And so I'm just going to start by typing in the word view all, and then I would like to display a count of how many comments have been published on this post. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to need to perform a search through my database for all of the comments that have been linked or published to this post. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, as I said, and I will perform a search through my database for all of the comments where the original post that they were published to equals the same value as the current sales post within our repeating group here. And then what I'd like to do is just perform a count on how many comments there are where they have in fact been published to this post. I'm then going to add in a space and type in the word comments. I can just see I've missed a letter there. I'll add that in. And now essentially this text here should only be displayed when one or more comment has been added or published into this particular post. Because if there are no comments, I'm not going to want to display a count of how many there are, just because there'd be no data to display. And so in order to make sure this particular text element is only displayed when it's needed, I'm going to head to our layout tab, and I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I'm also going to select to collapse this element when it's hidden, just so that way any elements below this will move up and take its place when it's not being displayed. I'm then going to head to our conditional tab here, and I'm going to define a condition that once again just performs a search through our database for all of the comments where the original post that comment was published on equals the same value as the current sales post. And if the count of comments that were published on this post is greater than, I'm going to type in the number 0, what I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible and tick that that should now be true. And so now this element is only going to be visible whenever a comment has in fact been published on this post. And later on, when we build out the comment functionality, we're going to create a way to redirect a user through to a dedicated comment page like the real world Instagram experience whenever they click on this text here. And finally, the very last thing I'd like to add into our repeating group cell is just going to be a group element that displays the profile photo of the person who's logged in viewing this feed, as well as just a small message that prompts them to add a comment on this post. And so in order to do that, I'm going to add in just a group element into my repeating group here. When it comes to this group, I'm going to head to our appearance tab. I will remove the style of it, and I'll set the background style to be a flat color. I'm then going to jump to our layout tab here, and I'd like to set the container layout to be a row, because this group is actually going to be quite similar to the existing group up here, where we had added in a profile photo followed by someone's name. And so when it also comes to this group, I'm going to unselect that this should be fixed width. Like always, I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'm also just going to want to move this group down to be the last element within our repeating group. So I'm going to set this to be the make last option. And now within this group, before I update the remaining responsive settings, I'm just going to choose to add in an image element. And in order to actually speed up this whole process, I could just choose to copy this existing image element that we've added into our existing group. So I'm just going to paste this in here. Only this time, instead of this image being 50 pixels, I'm going to make this 40 pixels just so it's a little bit smaller. And when it comes to the actual data source of this image, we're going to need to update this. In this case, I just want it to display the current user. So that is the person who is logged in, viewing their Instagram feed. I'd like to display their profile photo. And like always, I just want to process this image with Imgex, just so I can resize the dimensions by cropping it. And then finally, I just like to add in some text beside this element that just displays the word add a comment ... And then I'm going to head to our layout tab here. I will first of all vertically align that in the center of our group. I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0. I'll set the minimum height to also be 0. And then I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin around this whole element here. And if I really wanted, I could also just jump to my appearance tab and remove the style of this text element. And I could just choose to make this a lighter shade of gray. So that way this looks like this text isn't as prominent as the rest of the text within this post. And then from here, I'm going to click on the group that it sits within. I'll head to our layout tab here, and I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Of course, when we preview or publish our application, we could also remove the styling of this group, so that way it's just not a solid flat color. You could just make it transparent again. But for the time being, I'm going to leave it as it is. Before I go and just show you a quick preview of this page, what I'm just going to need to do is also just click on my orange group here. If you remembered, I had just added in 30 pixels of margin at the top while we were adding in these remaining elements. What I want to do is just remove that now, just so it sits up against the image above it there. And that's actually everything we'll need to build onto our homepage here. As you can see, there was quite a bit of detail that we had to add onto this page to make it completely functional. And one thing I'd just like to point out is that when it comes to our repeating group here, although we can only see one cell, this repeating group will continually expand downwards based on how many images need to be displayed on our homepage feed. And I'll be showing you in an example in a moment. But just the last thing I'd like to do to our repeating group is just remove the minimum height underneath the layout tab here. And then finally, I'd also just like to add in some margin at the bottom of our last group element here. I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin. And that's just going to ensure that between this last element and the next cell of our repeating group, there's just going to be some space in between each cell. But from here, what I'd like to do is now just show you a preview of how our Instagram homepage is going to function in terms of how it's going to display the different styles of posts that have been uploaded into our application. Over in the preview of my homepage here, as you can see, everything has come together quite nicely on my page. One thing I have just noticed though is that with my post that I had published before of my carousel, I can just see that the repeating group itself isn't being displayed within the group that we had created. And I think I have a hunch as to why that is the case. So I'm just going to quickly jump back into my bubble editor here. And if I was to jump to my elements tree and open up my group with the carousel repeating group inside of it, I'm just going to click on the actual repeating group itself. And you may remember that when it came to this repeating group, we had previously copied and pasted it across from our upload page, which just also meant that it had copied across all of the additional settings that we had given it on the upload page itself. And I don't know if you remember, but on the upload page, we had unselected that this element was visible on page load. And so it's also copied across that setting onto our home page. So what we're going to do is we're just going to tick that this element should be visible on page load. And of course, it's just going to be hidden within the yellow group it sits within. But if I was to jump back into Bubble now and just refresh my application here, what I can now see is that the repeating group post itself is now being displayed. So I can see a carousel of all of the images that were published within that repeating group. And if I was to reduce the size of my browser to make it look roughly like a mobile device, I could actually scroll across all of these images like an actual carousel post. If I was to also scroll down on my homepage, I've also published some additional posts. So you can see here I've just got a single image post, which I should also just mention, this page is fully responsive. So if we were to expand this out on desktop, as you can see, the image and all of the elements around it will expand. But if we're viewing this on mobile, it's then going to contract to the right device size. And if I was to show you a quick preview of how this page actually looks on a mobile device, as you can see here in my screen recording, the carousel is completely responsive. If I was to scroll on down, I can see my single image post here. And I've also published a video, which I can click to play this. And it's just going to load that from our database and it'll play it like a regular video. And then if we wanted, we could continually scroll on down. And that is how we can create a home page that allows us to build a completely dynamic grid of Instagram posts. And of course, from here, later on in our tutorial, we're going to build out all of the necessary engagement features, like being able to add likes onto posts as well as comments. Back in my Notion checklist, I'm just going to tick off that we've finished building out the feature to create our homepage feed. And once again, I know this was quite an extensive tutorial within our overall course today, but it was definitely one of the most important features to build out when it comes to building your own Instagram clone. And that is all I have time for within our YouTube tutorial today. As you can see, even after 3 hours of walking through the process of building our Instagram clone, we've barely scratched the surface in what's possible. At this point, we're still yet to create features like commenting and liking posts, as well as building out user profiles, creating an inbox where people can send messages between each other, and even adding our Instagram stories feature. If you wanted to get access to the full course, I'd recommend hitting the link in the description where you can purchase access to the entire course, which contains over 10 hours of content. And throughout the rest of that course, I'm going to be walking you through all of the additional features you'll need in order to bring your Instagram clone to life. In the meantime though, if you found this tutorial helpful, I recommend hitting the subscribe button on my YouTube channel, so that way you can stay up to date with any additional Bubble content that I publish. But in the meantime, I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.